I went to the hospital to welcome my newborn nephew into the world carrying a custom gift basket that cost more than my first car. But as I approached the slightly open door of the VIP maternity suite, I found my husband leaning over my sister's bed. "Our son will carry my last name," he whispered softly, kissing her forehead. "My stupid wife will pay for our life together." I did not scream. I did not burst into tears. I quietly walked back to my car, dropped the expensive gift in a hallway trash can, and started preparing my counterattack. My name is Brianna, and I am 30 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to ruthlessly dismantle your own life just to ensure the people who betrayed you faced absolute ruin. The sterile, brightly lit corridors of the Bethesda Medical Center smelled of strong antiseptic and faint floral arrangements. It was 11 in the evening on a Tuesday, and the maternity ward was quiet. I was walking down the hall of the luxury wing, balancing a massive gift basket against my hip. I had come straight from my office at a major corporate firm where I worked as a senior financial risk analyst. My brain was still buzzing with spreadsheets, liability assessments, and risk mitigation strategies, completely unaware that the greatest liability of my entire life was waiting for me at the end of the hall. My younger sister, Cassidy, had just given birth to her first child. Cassidy was 28, an aspiring social media influencer who cared more about aesthetic online feeds than actual reality. She was the undisputed golden child of our family. Our parents, Thomas and Cynthia, treated her like fragile glass, constantly demanding that I, the practical and financially stable older sister, pave the way for her success. Cassidy was married to Jamal, a 31-year-old African-American registered nurse who loved her with a blind, exhausting devotion. Jamal was actually working in this very hospital tonight. He had taken on a grueling double night shift down on the cardiac floor just to pay the staggering out-of-pocket costs for Cassidy to have this exact VIP maternity suite. She had thrown a massive fit, claiming her followers expected a luxury birth experience, and Jamal, ever the dedicated provider, had broken his back to give it to her. I had always respected Jamal. He was a good, honest man trapped in the exhausting orbit of my sister's vanity. I reached room 614, intending to push the door open and surprise her. My husband Derek had supposedly arrived 2 hours earlier to drop off some balloons and offer his congratulations on behalf of us both. Derek was 32, a self-proclaimed tech entrepreneur whose startup had been bleeding money for 3 years. My money, to be exact. I was the breadwinner, the safety net. The one keeping our upscale lifestyle afloat while he attended networking events and pitched vague ideas to anyone who would listen. The heavy wooden door of the VIP suite was ajar just enough for a sliver of warm yellow light to spill out into the hallway. I shifted the heavy gift basket to my other arm, ready to announce myself. But the sound of Derek's voice, low and incredibly intimate, made me freeze in my tracks. "You did so good, baby," Derek murmured. I peered through the narrow crack. Cassidy was propped up against a mountain of white pillows, looking remarkably put together for a woman who had just undergone a major medical procedure. Derek was leaning over the bed. He was not standing at a polite distance like a brother-in-law should. His hand was resting on the back of her neck, his fingers tangled in her hair. As I watched, paralyzed by the sudden icy dread flooding my veins, Derek leaned down and kissed my sister softly, lingeringly on her forehead. "He is perfect," Cassidy whispered, looking down at the sleeping infant in the bassinet beside her. "But I hate that Jamal thinks he is the father. I hate that we have to hide this." Derek stroked her cheek, his thumb tracing her jawline. "We will not have to hide it for much longer," he promised softly. "Our son will carry my last name. We just need to wait a little bit. My stupid wife will pay for our life together, and Jamal will cover these ridiculous hospital bills. Once the startup gets that final round of funding from Brianna's accounts, we take the baby and we go." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Our son, my stupid wife. For a fraction of a second, the universe simply stopped. The breath left my lungs and my vision tunneled. This was the man I shared a home with, the man whose business I was funding with my grueling 60-hour work weeks. And the woman in the bed was my own flesh and blood, the sister I had protected and provided for since we were children. They had not just slept together, they had created a child right under my nose, and they were actively plotting to bleed me dry before running away to start a new life. A normal person might have pushed that door open. A normal woman might have screamed, thrown the gift basket at their heads, demanded answers, and caused a spectacular scene that would have brought the hospital security running. But I am not a normal woman. I am a senior financial risk analyst. I spend my entire life calculating threats, assessing damages, and neutralizing liabilities before they can destroy a portfolio. In that split second outside room 614, my emotional self completely shut down and the analyst took over. Screaming would achieve nothing. Confronting them now would only give them warning. It would allow Derek to hide assets, delete emails, and scramble for a legal defense. If they knew that I knew, they would accelerate their timeline. I needed time. I needed data. I needed to trap them in their own financial snare. I slowly took a step back from the door. My flat, sensible work shoes made absolutely no sound on the polished hospital floor. I turned away from the warm light of the suite and walked back down the long, sterile corridor. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were entirely steady. As I reached the elevator bank, I paused next to a large industrial trash can. I looked down at the luxury gift basket in my arms. It was filled with hundreds of dollars worth of organic baby clothes, imported lotions, and a plush designer teddy bear. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I dropped the entire basket into the trash can. It landed with a dull thud, buried under discarded coffee cups and paper towels. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. The descent was quiet. I stared at my reflection in the mirrored doors. My perfectly pressed suit, my neat hair, my calm face. I looked exactly the same as I had 10 minutes ago, but the woman inside was entirely different. The loving, supportive wife was dead. The accommodating older sister was gone. I walked to my car, the crisp night air biting at my skin. I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and locked it. The silence of the garage was absolute. I did not turn the key in the ignition. Instead, I sat in the darkness, my mind already building the framework of a counterattack that would leave them both with absolutely nothing. The leather steering wheel felt freezing beneath my palms as I sat in the shadowy depths of the hospital parking garage. My breathing was shallow, measured, and entirely controlled. In my line of work, panic is a liability. When a corporation faces a sudden catastrophic market shift, the first step is never to scream. The first step is to assess the exposure. I reached into my designer tote bag, pulled out my smartphone, and opened my primary banking application. The screen glowed harshly in the dark cabin, scanning my face to unlock our joint financial portfolio. Derek and I had maintained a joint high-yield savings account for the past 5 years. It was our designated nest egg, a meticulously accumulated fund, built almost entirely from my annual performance bonuses at the firm. I had watched that number grow incrementally, month by month, tracking the compound interest with the satisfaction of a woman securing her family's foundation. Every skipped morning coffee, every delayed vehicle upgrade, every weekend spent analyzing market trends instead of relaxing at a spa had been poured into that account. I had sacrificed and worked grueling 60-hour weeks to push that balance to exactly $120,000. We were supposed to use it for a down payment on a larger house in the Bethesda suburbs. That was the lie I had been sold. When the dashboard loaded, the large bold numbers at the top of the screen did not display $120,000. The available balance read exactly $42.16. I blinked, the harsh blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. My thumb swiped down to refresh the page, assuming it was a server error. The numbers remained unchanged, $42.16. I tapped into the transaction history, my risk analyst brain rapidly processing the data in front of me. There it was. A massive, singular wire transfer executed just 3 days ago. The destination account was listed under Derek Vanguard Innovations, LLC. The memo line attached to the transfer was a masterpiece of corporate deceit. It read, "Seed funding capital injection." He had not just kissed my sister. He had cleaned me out. Derek had weaponized his perpetually failing tech startup, using it as a legitimate-looking corporate vehicle to siphon my life savings out of our joint account. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. He had legally transferred marital assets into an LLC that I already knew was drowning in debt. But now, after what I had just witnessed in room 614, the missing pieces snapped into perfect alignment. That money was not going towards software development or marketing campaigns. That $120,000 was their getaway fund. It was the financial runway they needed to abandon Jamal, discard me, and start their twisted new life together with their stolen baby. My chest tightened, a brief, violent surge of physical pain threatening to break my composure. He had stolen my labor, my security, and my future. I gripped the edges of my phone, the metal casing biting into my skin. I was just about to pull up my investment portfolio to check for further damage when the screen abruptly changed. A harsh chime echoed through the silent car. A text message notification dropped down from the top of the screen. It was from my mother, Cynthia. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the text. It read, "Transfer $15,000 for Cassidy's VIP suite bill by tomorrow morning." Jamal's nursing insurance did not cover the luxury upgrades. You are the older sister, do your part and make sacrifices. The sheer unadulterated entitlement radiating from those words felt like a physical slap across the face. My mind instantly broke down the reality of the situation. Jamal, a hard-working registered nurse, possessed standard hospital health insurance. It covered a standard delivery, standard care, and a standard recovery room. But standard was never good enough for Cassidy. She had demanded the top-floor luxury maternity suite, complete with premium linens, gourmet meals, and a panoramic view of the city, all so she could curate the perfect aesthetic for her social media followers. Jamal was currently on his feet working a brutal overnight shift on the cardiac ward, just floors below her, breaking his back to cover whatever expenses he could. And instead of holding her precious golden child accountable, Cynthia was simply passing the luxury upgrade bill to me. They expected me to subsidize the delivery of a baby created from my husband's infidelity. They wanted my hard-earned corporate salary to pay for the premium silk sheets Cassidy was currently lying on while Derek kissed her forehead. They expected me to sponsor my own betrayal. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips. It echoed strangely in the confined space of my vehicle. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was almost impressive. For my entire life, Thomas and Cynthia had treated me like a secondary character in the grand, glamorous production of Cassidy's life. I was the responsible one, the boring, reliable workhorse whose sole purpose was to generate the capital required to fund their country club lifestyle and Cassidy's endless whims. They thought I was a walking ATM. They thought my success was simply a resource for them to mine whenever they encountered a minor inconvenience. Derek thought I was a gullible, numbers-obsessed fool who would not notice a drained savings account until he was already 1,000 miles away. They all believed that my devotion to this family made me blind. They were about to learn a very brutal lesson about what a senior financial risk analyst actually does for a living. I do not just manage money. I study human behavior. I calculate vulnerabilities. I build models based on the assumption that everyone is capable of catastrophic failure. And when I find a liability, I do not just ignore it, I isolate it, I expose it, and I liquidate it entirely. My fingers hovered over the digital keyboard. I did not type a paragraph of rage. I did not ask about the missing money or demand an explanation for the staggering hospital bill. I kept my response perfectly aligned with the role they expected me to play. I typed 2 simple words. No worries. I hit send. I turned the phone off and tossed it onto the passenger seat. The darkness of the parking garage wrapped around me again, but the suffocating weight in my chest was gone. The shock had evaporated completely, replaced by a freezing, hyper-focused clarity. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of leather and cold air. The emotional, loving wife who had driven into this garage an hour ago was permanently gone. In her place sat a professional operative ready to execute a hostile takeover of her own life. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and shifted the car into drive. It was time to go home and start the audit. I pulled into the driveway of our 4-bedroom colonial in the silent, sleeping suburbs. The motion sensor lights flickered on, illuminating the perfectly manicured lawn and the pristine exterior of the house I had worked so hard to afford. The property was dark and empty, a beautiful shell hiding a rotting core. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and walked straight up the hardwood stairs to my home office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me, dropped my keys on the glass desk, and powered up my workstation. Three curved monitors hummed to life, casting a harsh clinical blue glow across the dark room. I ignored my standard consumer banking applications. The time for basic tracking was over. I logged into my corporate terminal through a secure virtual private network, launching the deep-level forensic accounting software I normally reserved for dismantling fraudulent multinational corporations. I needed to see the absolute bottom of this financial bloodbath. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, entering my social security number, pulling data directly from the primary financial mainframes, and initiating a comprehensive tri-bureau credit report on myself. The progress bar loaded, fetching years of historical data in seconds. The results populated across my center screen in a dense grid of numbers and red flags. I stared at the data, the clinical detachment of my profession fighting a fierce battle against the rising tide of absolute fury. My immaculate, carefully guarded credit score had completely tanked. I scrolled down to the active accounts section. 3 brand new high-limit credit cards glared back at me like open wounds. A platinum travel card, a premium rewards card, and a top-tier business line of credit had all been opened within the last 4 months. I had not authorized a single one of them. I pulled the digital origination files to examine the application data. Derek had orchestrated a masterpiece of identity theft. He knew my social security number, my mother's maiden name, my first pet, and every obscure security answer required to bypass the automated verification protocols. He had forged my digital signature on the binding agreements, checking the specific liability boxes that made me solely responsible for the massive debt. To cover his tracks, he had routed the physical cards and the monthly statements to a private commercial post office box across town, ensuring a piece of mail never accidentally arrived at our actual home. The balances on these fraudulent cards were staggering. He had pulled maximum cash advances and charged tens of thousands of dollars in luxury expenses, completely maxing out the available credit. But unsecured credit card debt was just the surface layer of this betrayal. I needed to check the hard assets. I opened a new tab on my right monitor and accessed the county clerk's property records database. I pulled the deed and lien history for the exact house I was currently sitting in. I had provided the entire $80,000 down payment for this property before Derek and I were even married, securing it as my primary asset. A fresh document had been filed and approved exactly 30 days ago. It was a second mortgage. A massive, crushing lien had been quietly placed against the equity I had spent years meticulously building. I pulled up the digitized loan documents and scrutinized the signatures. Derek had used a remote online e-notary service to finalize the paperwork. He had likely hired another woman to sit in front of the webcam, holding a fake identification card, or he had simply exploited a vulnerability in the digital certificate process to forge my consent entirely. He had effectively hollowed out our home behind my back, extracting every ounce of financial value, and leaving me holding an empty, debt-ridden shell that was inching dangerously close to foreclosure. The puzzle was rapidly expanding, shifting from simple spousal theft to complex, premeditated federal fraud. I needed to follow the flow of the stolen capital. The $120,000 drained from our joint savings, the maximum cash advances pulled from the 3 fraudulent credit cards, and the massive lump sum payout from the second mortgage totaled nearly $400,000. I needed to know exactly where that money had disappeared to. Derek's supposed tech startup had no actual payroll, no physical office lease, and produced no viable consumer product. The money was not being burned on terrible business decisions or failing marketing campaigns. It was being strategically hoarded. I accessed the routing data attached to the initial wire transfers. Using a network packet analyzer and basic tracing tools, I isolated the specific IP addresses that had initiated the fraudulent transactions. The digital footprints did not originate from a secure banking facility or a remote corporate office. They traced directly back to our home network router, matching the exact MAC address of Derek's personal laptop. He had committed wire fraud and identity theft while sitting casually on our living room sofa, likely while I was upstairs sleeping before an early morning commute. I tracked the destination routing numbers to see where the stolen funds finally rested. Derek had bounced the money through a regional bank in Delaware, a pathetic attempt to obscure the trail from a casual observer. But to a forensic analyst, the path was glaringly obvious. The funds ultimately landed in a commercial holding account. I needed the specific name attached to that final destination. I ran a cross-reference search through the state business registry, paying the expedited processing fee to instantly pull the raw corporate incorporation documents. A heavy PDF file loaded on my screen. It was an Articles of Organization filing for a newly formed limited liability company. The entity was named Golden Horizon Wellness LLC. I scrolled down past the generic business descriptions to the ownership section. I looked at the registered agent and sole proprietor listed on the official legally binding state charter. The name was typed in bold, undeniable print, Cassidy Jenkins. My sister was not just his mistress. She was his legally designated business partner in a massive criminal conspiracy. They had funneled every stolen dollar, every ounce of my home equity, and all of my liquidated savings into a shell company completely controlled by Cassidy. In the eyes of the law, that massive sum of money now belonged to her newly formed business. They had effectively transferred my entire net worth directly into her pocket. The VIP hospital suite, the designer baby clothes, the future they were planning together. It was all built entirely on the absolute financial destruction of my life. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, letting the cold reality wash over me. They had orchestrated a brilliant, ruthless trap. They thought I would simply drown in the sudden debt, too overwhelmed and financially crippled to ever fight back. They made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. They left a digital paper trail, and they left it for a woman who dismantled fraudulent corporations for a living. The harsh morning sunlight finally breached the blinds of my home office, casting long shadows across the screens that displayed my husband's ultimate betrayal. I had not slept a single minute. My eyes burned, but my mind was sharp, hypervigilant, and completely locked into the reality of my new existence. I closed the encrypted files, cleared my browser history, and shut down the forensic software just as I heard the heavy click of the front door unlocking downstairs. Derek was home. I walked out to the landing and watched him step into the foyer. He was a master of his craft. He shrugged off his coat with a heavy performative sigh, running a hand through his perfectly tousled hair to project the exact image of an exhausted, devoted family man who had spent the entire night supporting his sister-in-law. He looked up, caught my eye, and immediately produced a warm, weary smile. He climbed the stairs and reached out, pulling me into a tight embrace. The scent of sterile hospital soap and faint, expensive perfume clung to his shirt. It took every ounce of psychological discipline I possessed not to recoil from his touch. I buried my face in his shoulder, forcing my arms to wrap around his waist, playing my part flawlessly. He kissed the top of my head and led me into the kitchen, groaning about the uncomfortable hospital waiting room chairs. He poured us both coffee, moving with the casual ease of a man who believed he held all the winning cards. We sat across from each other at the granite island. He reached out and covered my hand with his. His thumb stroked my knuckles, a gesture that used to make me feel safe. Now it just made my skin crawl. He took a slow sip of his coffee and looked at me with deep manufactured concern. He said he needed to talk to me about something serious. He claimed his tech startup had encountered an unexpected snag with a major supplier. A temporary financial roadblock, he called it. He used all the right buzzwords, weaving a complex tale about supply chain disruptions and delayed vendor payouts. He lied to my face with such effortless grace that I found myself briefly marveling at his sociopathy. He assured me the company was on the verge of a massive breakthrough, but he needed a bridge loan to keep the servers running until the next quarter. Before I could even process the audacity of him asking for more money after secretly draining our accounts, he seamlessly pivoted his manipulation to my sister. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of deep brotherly distress. He told me how much Cassidy was struggling. He painted a tragic picture of Jamal buckling under the weight of the VIP hospital bills, ignoring the fact that those bills were entirely optional and entirely Cassidy's fault. Derek squeezed my hand tighter. He reminded me how much I loved my sister. He reminded me that family always steps up. Then he delivered the final sickening pitch. He gently suggested that I cash out my personal corporate stock options. He reasoned that liquidating those assets would provide enough capital to save his business and help poor Cassidy cover her newborn expenses. He was asking me to voluntarily hand over the absolute last of my independent wealth to fund their escape. I looked into his eyes. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let a soft, reassuring smile spread across my face. I told him I understood completely. I praised his dedication to his company and his endless compassion for my sister. I squeezed his hand right back and promised him I would contact my corporate broker first thing Monday morning to begin the liquidation process. The sheer, unadulterated relief that washed over his features was palpable. His shoulders dropped, the tension leaving his jaw. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed I was a compliant, oblivious stepping stone on his path to a new life with Cassidy. He thanked me profusely, calling me the greatest wife a man could ever ask for. He kissed my cheek one last time, announced he was desperate for a hot shower after the long night, and bounded up the stairs with a renewed, victorious energy. I sat alone in the kitchen, listening to the water turn on in the master bathroom directly above me. The facade had been maintained, the trap was set, but the universe was not finished handing me ammunition. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter. A sudden chime broke the silence, signaling a new high-priority incoming email. I glanced at the screen. The sender address was automatically flagged by my inbox filters. It was a secure message from the Bethesda Hospital patient portal. Jamal had listed me as the secondary emergency contact and medical proxy on all family health documents years ago, a practical decision since I was the only one in the family who reliably answered a phone in a crisis. The hospital's automated system had generated a routine update regarding the newborn's preliminary pediatric health screenings. It was a misrouted notification, an administrative glitch that sent the data to the secondary proxy instead of the primary account. I opened the encrypted attachment using my pre-authorized family access code. The PDF loaded, displaying a standard array of infant vital signs, weight length, and APGAR scores. But my eyes zeroed in on one specific line of medical data near the bottom of the page. The preliminary blood typing laboratory results. The infant's blood type was explicitly listed as O negative. I stared at the black and white text. My corporate risk analysis training requires a foundation in statistical data and hard facts. Years ago, during a family medical emergency with our father, I had organized a blood drive. I knew the exact blood types of everyone in my immediate circle. Jamal was type AB positive. Cassidy was type A positive. The cold, hard laws of biology clicked into place inside my mind. A parent with type AB blood possesses both the A and B antigens. They can only pass an A or a B allele to their offspring. It is a strict genetic impossibility for an AB parent to produce a child with type O blood. A type O child requires two O alleles, meaning both biological parents must carry the O gene. Jamal could not possibly be the father of that child. But Derek was O negative, the universal donor. I sat perfectly still, the sound of the shower rushing upstairs fading into the background. The financial theft was a crime of greed. The affair was a crime of betrayal. But this piece of paper was irrefutable biological proof of their absolute depravity. They were not just stealing my money to start a new life. They were actively deceiving a good, innocent man, tricking Jamal into legally claiming and financially supporting a child conceived from their deceit. I slowly closed the laptop, the screen going black. I now had the motive, the financial trail, and the DNA proof. Derek was washing the hospital off his skin upstairs, completely unaware that his perfect exit strategy was already dead. The pieces were all firmly in my hands. Now it was time to deploy them. 4 days later, I found myself standing in the grand vaulted foyer of my parents' sprawling suburban estate, mentally preparing myself to endure the most suffocating theatrical performance of my life. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of imported lilies and expensive catering. Cynthia and Thomas did not do simple family dinners. Every gathering was a curated high society event designed to showcase their wealth and reinforce their carefully constructed image of absolute perfection. Tonight was supposedly an intimate post-hospital welcome-home celebration for my sister and the new baby, but the driveway was already lined with luxury vehicles belonging to their closest, wealthiest friends. I handed my coat to a hired server and stepped into the main living room. The sheer pretension of the space was almost dizzying. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, glittering light over the imported Italian marble floors. At the center of it all, lounging on a custom velvet chaise like a conquering queen, was Cassidy. She was draped in a cashmere shawl cradling the infant while accepting a steady stream of fawning compliments from Cynthia's socialite friends. Cassidy looked flawless, her makeup professionally applied, complaining loudly about the exhausting demands of motherhood while handing the baby off to a hired night nurse the moment he made a sound. Standing just outside the circle of admirers was Jamal. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He was still wearing his blue hospital scrubs, having clearly rushed over directly from another grueling nursing shift. He looked physically hollowed out, fetching sparkling water and arranging pillows for his wife with a quiet, desperate devotion. My chest tightened as I watched him. He was a good man, pouring every ounce of his energy into a family that was actively making a fool of him. And then there was Derek. My husband was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch standing near the fireplace, beaming with the proud protective aura of a doting uncle. He laughed at my father's jokes, charmed my mother's friends, and occasionally cast a warm, affectionate gaze toward Cassidy and the baby. The level of deception was sickening. Knowing the truth, possessing the biological data and the financial records made the entire room feel like a grotesque circus. Every smile felt like an attack. Every shared laugh grated against my nerves. I maintained my perfectly neutral, supportive expression, playing the role of the devoted older sister, but the atmosphere in that house was rapidly becoming unbreathable. Needing a moment to escape the noise and the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume, I slipped away from the main gathering and walked into the formal dining room. The space was dimly lit and mercifully quiet, dominated by a massive mahogany table that could seat 20 people. I walked over to the tall bay windows, looking out at the meticulously landscaped backyard, trying to slow my breathing and maintain my tactical focus. My brief moment of solitude did not last. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, plunging the room into an even deeper silence. I turned around to find my mother and father advancing into the room, their expressions shifting instantly from party host warmth to cold, calculating business. The transition was so sharp it was almost impressive. Cynthia's high heels clicked sharply against the hardwood as she crossed the room, stopping just a few feet away from me. She did not bother with pleasantries. She bypassed the small talk entirely, her tone adopting the demanding, authoritative edge she always used when she expected immediate compliance. "We need to discuss Cassidy's living situation," Cynthia announced, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. "Jamal's apartment is simply unacceptable. It is a cramped two-bedroom shoebox on the wrong side of the city. It is entirely inappropriate for a growing family, and it is certainly not an environment fit for my grandson." My father stood beside her, presenting a united, intimidating front. He adjusted his expensive watch, his face locked in a stern frown. "Your sister is entering a critical phase of her life, Brianna. She needs space, security, and a proper environment to raise her child. Jamal simply does not have the capital to provide the lifestyle she requires right now. We cannot have them living like struggling college students. It reflects poorly on all of us." I maintained a perfectly blank expression, my risk analyst training keeping my face devoid of any reaction. I waited for the inevitable demand, knowing exactly where this coordinated ambush was heading. "You have that downtown condo?" Cynthia continued, her eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding glare. "The luxury loft you purchased before you married Derek. From what I understand, your current corporate tenants are moving out at the end of the month. The property is just sitting there gathering dust. It is 3 times the size of Jamal's place, and it is located in a premier school district." I stared at my parents, the sheer audacity of the conversation settling over me. That condo was the very first major asset I had ever acquired. I had saved for years to purchase it, scraping together the down payment entirely on my own, long before Derek ever entered my life. It was a legally protected, premarital asset, a fortress of absolute financial security completely shielded from my marriage. It was the only piece of property Derek had not been able to touch with his fraudulent second mortgage scheme. "We have already discussed it with the family attorney," my father said, speaking in a tone that suggested the matter was already decided. "We have drawn up the transfer paperwork. We want you to sign the deed over to Cassidy, free and clear. A generous gift from a successful older sister to help her sibling build a proper foundation." They were not asking me to rent it to her. They were not asking for a temporary living arrangement. They were boldly demanding that I sign away hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal real estate equity, handing over the deed entirely to the woman who was actively sleeping with my husband. Before I could even process the breathtaking entitlement radiating from my parents, the dining room doors pushed open again. Derek slipped into the room, closing the doors softly behind him. He walked up to my side, placing a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder. The physical contact made my stomach churn, but I did not flinch. He looked at my parents with an expression of deep, noble understanding, playing the role of the ultimate peacekeeper. "We have been incredibly blessed, Brianna," Derek murmured, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "We have our beautiful house in the suburbs, our careers, our stable life together. Cassidy is just starting out and she is overwhelmed. We have more than enough. Come on, honey, we need to be the bigger people here. Let us share our wealth and give your sister the security she deserves." I looked at the three of them surrounding me in the dim light of the dining room. The trap was absolutely flawless. Derek had drained our joint accounts and mortgaged our shared home to the breaking point. Now, utilizing my parents' blind favoritism, he was actively trying to strip me of my last remaining legal asset before he filed for divorce. They wanted me entirely destitute, left with nothing but crippling debt, while they walked away with everything I had ever built. I stood perfectly still, the silence stretching out as I locked eyes with the man who was actively trying to destroy my life, preparing to deliver my response. "No." The single syllable dropped from my lips, freezing the heavy air of the formal dining room. I did not shift my weight. I did not blink. I stared directly into Derek's feigned expression of brotherly concern before sweeping my gaze to my parents. My father's jaw slackened in genuine shock. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience, especially from me. Cynthia's perfectly manicured hands tightened into fists at her sides, her silk blouse rustling sharply in the sudden suffocating silence. "I think you misheard us," my father began, his voice dropping an octave into a low, threatening rumble. "This is not a negotiation, Brianna. Your sister requires that space." "I heard you perfectly," I replied, my voice steady and entirely devoid of the emotional deference they expected. "That property is my premarital asset. I purchased it with my own capital. It generates a substantial secondary income, and I will not be signing the deed over to anyone. I am not a charity, and I will not subsidize a lifestyle Cassidy has not earned." Derek immediately stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Bree, honey, please. Let us not be unreasonable. We have so much. Why hoard an empty condo when your own flesh and blood is struggling? If you are so deeply concerned about her struggle, Derek, you are more than welcome to purchase a property for her." I fired back, holding his gaze until I saw a microscopic flicker of unease crack his perfect mask. He knew I had the money. He thought he was about to get the last of it. That was when my mother completely lost her mind. The polished high society hostess vanished, replaced by a vicious, snarling woman who had always viewed me as an inferior byproduct of her perfect life. Cynthia stepped directly into my personal space, her face flushed with unadulterated rage. "You selfish, barren spinster!" She hissed, the words dripping with decades of concentrated venom. "That is what this is really about. You are standing here hoarding real estate because you are entirely consumed by jealousy. You cannot stand the fact that your younger sister is beautiful, fertile, and blessed with a perfect child, while your own womb is completely empty. You are trying to punish her for a joy you will never possess." The insult was designed to annihilate me. A week ago, those words would have brought me to my knees. I would have crumbled, apologized, and signed whatever documents they shoved in front of my face just to stop the verbal barrage. But the woman they were trying to break no longer existed. The financial models, the forged signatures, the O-negative blood type, all of it formed an impenetrable suit of armor around my mind. I looked at my mother with a profound, freezing emptiness. "My property remains mine," I stated, my voice as cold and flat as cracked ice. "Do not ever ask me for it again." I turned on my heel and walked away. My father shouted my name, a booming command that rattled the crystal in the china cabinets, but I did not stop. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped back into the bright, chaotic noise of the main hallway, leaving the three of them trapped in the toxic fallout of their failed ambush. I needed to leave this house immediately. I navigated through the crowd of laughing socialites, keeping my eyes fixed on the front foyer. As I rounded the corner near the kitchen, a body stepped backward out of the pantry and collided with me. "Brianna, I am so sorry," a deep, exhausted voice murmured. I looked up. It was Jamal. He was holding a stack of fresh linen napkins, looking like he was about to physically collapse. The harsh kitchen lighting illuminated the deep purple bags beneath his eyes. His broad shoulders were slumped, and the perpetual cheerful energy that usually defined his personality had been entirely drained away. "It is fine, Jamal," I said quietly, adjusting my purse. He hesitated, glancing down the hall toward the dining room. He had undoubtedly heard my father's booming voice. Jamal ran a heavy hand over his face, looking deeply embarrassed. "Listen, Bree." He started, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am sorry about your parents. I told Cassidy we do not need your condo. I told them not to ask you. We are absolutely fine in our apartment. You do not have to apologize for them, Jamal. Their entitlement is not your responsibility." "I just feel terrible," he continued, leaning against the wall, as if his legs could no longer support his own weight. "They treat you like an ATM, and Cassidy just lets them. I am doing everything I can to provide for her and the baby. I really am." I looked at him closely. The sheer level of fatigue radiating from his body was alarming. "You look like you have not slept in a week." Jamal let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "I haven't. I am pulling back-to-back double shifts on the cardiac ward. I am logging 60 hours a week right now." My risk analyst brain instantly booted up. "Why are you working 60 hours a week immediately after your wife gave birth? You are supposed to be on paternity leave." Jamal rubbed the back of his neck, looking deeply ashamed. "I had to cancel my leave. Cassidy hit a rough patch recently. She had some unexpected expenses pop up right before the delivery. Massive credit card debts that I had absolutely no idea about until the collection notices started arriving in the mail. The balances are staggering, Brianna. I am just trying to pick up the premium overtime shifts so we do not drown in interest rates before the baby is even a month old." The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place with deafening clarity. Cassidy did not have a sudden shopping addiction. She was intentionally maxing out her personal credit cards to fund her daily luxury lifestyle, shifting the entirety of her massive debt burden onto her husband. Meanwhile, she and Derek were secretly hoarding hundreds of thousands of dollars of my stolen capital inside their hidden shell company. They were systematically bleeding us both dry. They were using my life savings as their ultimate getaway fund, while simultaneously working Jamal to the point of absolute physical exhaustion to cover their tracks and fund their current expenses. I locked eyes with the man standing in front of me. Jamal was honest, hardworking, and fiercely devoted to a family that was actively making a fool of him. He was raising a child that did not belong to him. He was paying off debts that were accumulated through deceit. He was a victim trapped in the exact same slaughterhouse as I was. But unlike me, Jamal lived inside Cassidy's apartment. Jamal had direct access to her mail, her physical documents, and her unguarded smartphone. He was the perfect invisible Trojan horse. I stepped closer to him, dropping the polite sister-in-law facade completely. The freezing, hyper-focused clarity of a corporate auditor took over my voice. "Jamal," I said, staring directly into his tired eyes, "what time does your shift end tomorrow?" He blinked, visibly derailed by the sudden razor-sharp shift in my demeanor. The exhaustion seemed to drag down his features as he processed the question. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He stammered that his overnight rotation officially concluded at 6 in the morning, but the charge nurse usually cleared him for a 30-minute meal break around 2. I gave a single curt nod. I told him to meet me at the all-night diner directly across the street from the hospital's main entrance. I did not frame it as a request. Before he could formulate a response or ask a single question, I turned and walked out of the house, leaving the suffocating perfume and the glittering crystal chandeliers far behind me. The air inside the diner was thick with the smell of stale coffee and sizzling grease. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the pretentious opulence of my parents' suburban estate. Harsh, flickering fluorescent tubes hummed violently overhead, casting a sickly, jaundiced pallor over the cracked vinyl booths and sticky linoleum floors. At 2 in the morning, the clientele consisted mostly of exhausted paramedics, insomniac cab drivers, and people who had nowhere else to go. I sat perfectly still in a secluded corner booth, a cup of untouched lukewarm tea resting in front of me. Beneath my hands lay a thick, heavily secured manila folder. The bell above the glass door chimed. Jamal walked in. Under the brutal, unforgiving glare of the diner's overhead lighting, he looked entirely broken. His blue hospital scrubs were wrinkled, and his posture was that of a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He spotted me in the back corner and slid into the booth opposite me, waving off the tired waitress who approached with a stained menu. He ordered a black coffee, his voice raspy. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, looked at me, and asked what could possibly be so urgent that it could not wait until a decent hour. I did not offer platitudes. I did not ease him into the reality of his own destruction. I opened the manila folder, extracted the meticulously organized paper trail, and slid the dense stack of financial documents straight across the speckled laminate table. Jamal stared at the papers, his brow furrowing in confusion. He tentatively reached out and flipped over the top page. It was a comprehensive ledger of Cassidy's recent credit card statements, alongside the corresponding routing numbers I had tracked from my own hollowed-out savings account. His reaction was immediate and entirely defensive. He pushed the documents back toward me, the color rising in his cheeks. He told me he already knew about the debt. His voice took on a protective, aggressive edge as he insisted that his wife's financial mistakes were a private marital issue. He firmly stated that Cassidy was just overwhelmed, that she had made some immature decisions while dealing with severe prenatal anxiety, and that they were actively working through it together as a team. He looked me dead in the eye and declared that he loved his wife unconditionally. He grabbed the edge of the table, preparing to slide out of the booth, flatly refusing to sit there and listen to me disparage the mother of his newborn son. I placed my hand firmly on top of the documents, pinning them to the table. I told him to sit down and actually look at the data. I told him to stop looking at the astronomical balances and start looking at the specific dates and locations of the transactions. Reluctantly, Jamal sank back into the vinyl seat. I pulled a yellow highlighter from my purse and uncapped it. I flipped to the second page of Cassidy's premium credit card statement and highlighted a cluster of massive charges. $10,000 drained over a single weekend at an ultra-exclusive 5-star mountain resort in Aspen. I looked up at him and asked where his wife was on that exact weekend last October. Jamal frowned, his defensive posture faltering slightly as his tired mind worked to recall the memory. He muttered that Cassidy had been suffering from terrible stress. She had booked a solo holistic wellness retreat in the mountains to focus on mindfulness and prepare her body for the pregnancy. Without breaking eye contact, I reached into the folder and pulled out a separate sheet of paper. It was a printed copy of Derek's corporate travel and expense log, pulled directly from his synchronized calendar on our shared home network. I placed it right next to Cassidy's credit card statement. I dragged the yellow highlighter across Derek's itinerary for that exact same weekend in October. Derek was supposedly attending a high-level regional tech conference to pitch his startup to venture capitalists. The location listed on his itinerary was the exact same luxury mountain resort in Aspen. Jamal stared at the two highlighted dates, his breathing suddenly shallow. I did not give him time to rationalize it as a bizarre coincidence. I turned the page and highlighted a massive series of charges on Cassidy's account from late November. A luxury spa weekend in Sedona, Arizona. Again, Cassidy had claimed she needed solitary meditation away from the city. I placed Derek's corresponding travel log beside it. He had supposedly flown to Arizona for a critical angel investor summit. The dates matched flawlessly. I flipped the page again. A 4-day shopping spree in Miami during the dead of winter. Cassidy told him she was visiting an old college roommate who had recently suffered a bad breakup. Derek told me he was attending a mandatory blockchain networking event. The dates aligned with terrifying precision. The flights, the hotel bookings, the exorbitant restaurant bills. They mirrored each other completely. Every single time Cassidy required a solo wellness retreat to cope with her manufactured anxiety, Derek was simultaneously attending a fictitious tech conference in the exact same zip code. The massive debt Jamal was currently breaking his back to pay off was not accumulated through simple reckless shopping. He was actively financing their romantic illicit vacations. He was working 60-hour night shifts on a cardiac ward to pay for the king-sized hotel suites where his wife was sleeping with my husband. I watched the devastating truth physically manifest in Jamal. The protective defiance drained out of his eyes, replaced by a dark, hollow realization. The impenetrable wall of his denial shattered into a million pieces upon the cold, hard surface of the diner table. His hands began to tremble as he stared down at the highlighted documents, the undeniable geometric proof of his absolute betrayal staring right back at him. I watched the exact moment Jamal's heart broke. It was not a loud theatrical shattering, it was a silent, violent implosion. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his dark skin carrying an ashen, sickly undertone under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the diner. His broad, muscular shoulders, previously slumped with the heavy exhaustion of a 60-hour workweek, suddenly went rigidly tense. The nervous tremors in his hands stopped entirely. He slowly looked up from the highlighted bank statements and luxury travel itineraries meeting my gaze. The man looking back at me was no longer the exhausted, devoted husband, trying desperately to keep his new family afloat. The profound, desperate sadness in his eyes had rapidly crystallized into a sharp, terrifying, and absolute rage. He did not yell. He did not throw the papers back at me or flip the table. He carefully aligned the edges of the financial documents, tapping them against the sticky laminate surface with a terrifyingly calm, mechanical precision. He whispered that he had spent the last 3 nights sleeping upright in a stiff hospital chair just to save enough overtime pay to cover her customized postpartum massage therapy. He had sold his vintage motorcycle, his prized possession, that he had restored with his own hands to clear the first massive wave of credit card debt she claimed was strictly for essential baby supplies. I remained perfectly silent, letting the absolute venom of the betrayal course through his veins. I knew from my own recent experience that the anger was a necessary catalyst. It was the only raw fuel that would propel him through the nightmare of what came next. When he finally spoke again, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp, completely stripped of its usual warmth and optimism. He leaned across the table, the plastic of his hospital identification badge catching the harsh overhead light. He pointed out a glaring, fatal vulnerability in their arrogant, careless scheme. Cassidy and Derek had treated him like a naive pack mule, a convenient source of blind labor and legal legitimacy, but they had fundamentally underestimated his actual, tangible power in this situation. Jamal was the legally documented father listed on the birth certificate. He was the primary responsible policyholder on the premium medical insurance currently covering the child. More importantly, he was a highly respected senior registered nurse operating within the exact same medical network where his wife had just delivered. He possessed full, uncontested legal and administrative authority over the newborn's medical directives. He did not need a slow court order, he did not need an expensive family lawyer, and he absolutely did not need Cassidy's permission to act. He told me he was going to walk straight back across the freezing street, access the secure pediatric wing, and request a direct official DNA paternity test. He knew the attending physicians by their first names. He knew the senior lab technicians. He could easily classify the request under a routine preliminary genetic screening to bypass any administrative red flags or nosy questions, flag the file as urgent, and have the biological samples drawn before the morning shift even clocked in. It would be entirely off the books regarding Cassidy's knowledge, routed securely and directly to his personal staff portal. We agreed on strict, uncompromising operational security. There would be absolutely no text messages on our primary mobile devices. There would be no hushed, risky phone calls from our respective houses. We communicated exclusively through a secure, heavily encrypted messaging application I installed on his phone right there in the diner booth. Then he stood up, threw a $5 bill on the table for his black coffee, and walked back out into the freezing winter night to extract the undeniable biological truth. The trap was locked into place. Now we just had to survive the agonizing silent wait. The private laboratory required a minimum of 72 hours to process the expedited genetic panel. Those 3 days became a grueling, suffocating masterclass in psychological endurance. Through our encrypted channel, Jamal described the visceral, stomach-churning horror of returning to his cramped apartment. He had to walk through his front door, smile wearily, strip off his scrubs, and slide into bed next to the woman who had sold his entire life to another man. He had to listen to Cassidy endlessly complain about the lack of square footage and the outdated kitchen appliances while she scrolled through designer furniture catalogs on her phone. He had to cradle the infant against his chest, rocking the baby to sleep in the middle of the night, fully aware that he was staring down into the face of Derek's stolen legacy. He told me the absolute hardest part was not screaming until his throat bled. It was forcing his muscles to relax, forcing his voice to sound tender and reassuring, and playing the role of the oblivious, unconditionally loving provider, while a nuclear bomb ticked silently in his pocket. My own daily performance was equally taxing and thoroughly nauseating. I had to share my pristine, quiet colonial house with the very architect of my destruction. Every morning, Derek would stand in the kitchen, sipping his premium espresso, and casually ask for updates on my corporate stock liquidation. He framed his inquiries with a sickening practiced sweetness, kissing my forehead and calling me his family's ultimate savior. I played the gullible, deeply loving wife with Oscar-worthy precision. I manufactured complex fake delays, blaming my corporate broker for dragging their feet on the transfer paperwork and citing imaginary compliance holdups. I sat at my dining room table pretending to review financial documents with a furrowed brow, assuring Derek that the massive influx of capital would be freed up by the end of the week. He would stand behind my chair massaging my shoulders, thanking me endlessly for my sacrifice, entirely convinced that his grand fraudulent plan was executing perfectly. He thought I was blindly dismantling my own wealth to hand him a golden parachute. The cognitive dissonance was suffocating. I smiled at him over our catered dinners, while mentally calculating the exact layout of his digital fraud. I ironed his expensive dress shirts while plotting the systematic total liquidation of his reputation. Every tick of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a heavy hammer striking an anvil. We were both smiling, both playing our designated roles in this grotesque theater, both waiting for the final bloody curtain to drop. The tension in our respective homes grew so dense, it felt like walking through deep water. 72 hours later, my burner phone vibrated with a single encrypted coordinate. It was a desolate concrete parking structure 3 blocks from the hospital, buried entirely underground and mercifully devoid of security cameras. I parked my car on the lowest sublevel, turned off the engine, and waited in the suffocating darkness. The rhythmic dripping of a leaky overhead pipe echoed like a metronome ticking down to 0. 10 minutes later, a set of headlights swept across the concrete pillars. Jamal pulled his battered sedan into the spot directly beside mine. He cut the engine, stepped out into the shadows, and slipped silently into my passenger seat. The heavy thud of the car door closing sealed us inside a private, airtight vault. He did not say hello. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a stark white tamper-evident envelope bearing the official crest of the hospital's genetics laboratory. The paper was slightly crumpled, indicating how tightly he had been gripping it during the walk to his car. We sat in the dim, ambient glow of the dashboard console, staring at the physical manifestation of our ruined marriages. I held my breath as Jamal hooked his finger under the flap and ripped it open. The tearing sound was violent in the confined space. He pulled out the clinical report, his large hands trembling slightly as his eyes scanned the dense medical jargon. I watched his throat work as he swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the final paragraph on the second page. He handed the paper to me, his face utterly devoid of color. I looked down at the bold black text printed at the bottom of the sheet. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The subject tested was a confirmed biological match to the reference sample secretly swabbed from the discarded coffee cup Derek had left in my kitchen sink. The truth was no longer a working theory or a paranoid suspicion. It was a cold, indisputable scientific fact. Derek was the father of Cassidy's child. Jamal let out a ragged, shuddering breath, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. The last shred of his denial evaporated, leaving behind a raw, hardened shell of a man. We sat in the heavy silence for a long moment, allowing the absolute gravity of the situation to settle over us. Then I reached into the back seat and retrieved my encrypted laptop. The time for morning had officially passed. It was time to dissect the enemy. I opened the laptop and booted up the hidden partition containing the offshore LLC documents I had previously extracted from Derek's home office network. I angled the screen so Jamal could see the complex web of shell companies and hidden bank accounts. I explained that Derek and Cassidy were not just carrying on a reckless affair. They were actively executing a highly sophisticated, premeditated exit strategy. I opened a subfolder labeled with a generic alphanumeric code and clicked on a series of recently finalized lease agreements. The properties were not in our state. They were luxury single-family homes located in a high-end gated community in Austin, Texas. The lease was co-signed by the LLC, effectively masking the true occupants. I walked Jamal through the corresponding financial projections, pulling up the meticulous spreadsheets Derek thought he had secured. The timing was too precise to be accidental. Derek was intentionally dragging out our marriage for another 3 weeks because that was the exact date my corporate stock options fully vested. He was fully expecting me to liquidate those shares to pay off the fraudulent second mortgage he had secretly taken out on our house. Simultaneously, Cassidy was stalling her own legal maneuvers, waiting for Jamal to finish paying off the exorbitant out-of-pocket VIP maternity ward bills and clear her luxury credit card debts. She had purposefully opted for the most expensive uninsured private birthing suites and elective premium care, knowing Jamal would automatically shoulder the financial burden. The sickening elegance of their conspiracy became crystal clear as we traced the money flow line by line. They were using us as temporary financial shields. Once Jamal cleared Cassidy's debts and I replenished Derek's drained accounts, they planned to simultaneously file for contested divorces. They would freeze our remaining assets, drain the newly restored equity, and completely blindside us with aggressive legal maneuvers. Before the ink on the divorce filings even dried, they would be on a plane to Texas with the baby living entirely off the stolen capital we had been breaking our backs to provide. They intended to leave us both entirely destitute, buried in crippling legal fees, and utterly destroyed. I watched the realization wash over Jamal. The sheer sociopathic nature of the plan extinguished any lingering trace of the gentle, forgiving nurse he used to be. The betrayal went far beyond infidelity. It was a calculated financial assassination. Derek and Cassidy viewed us not as human beings, but as disposable stepping stones to their new life. They had monetized our love, weaponized our trust, and planned to discard us the moment our usefulness expired. Jamal slowly turned his head to look at me, his jaw set like granite. The exhausted, heartbroken husband was gone. The man sitting in my passenger seat now possessed the cold, lethal focus of a soldier stepping onto a battlefield. He did not shed a single tear. He asked me exactly what we needed to do to burn their entire operation to the ground. I closed the laptop with a sharp, decisive snap. Our alliance was instantly forged in steel, cemented by the undeniable proof of our shared exploitation. We were no longer victims waiting for the inevitable slaughter. We were the architects of their impending ruin. I told Jamal that we were going to let them believe their flawless plan was working perfectly. We would continue to play our roles, subsidizing their debts and smiling through the deception. But beneath the surface, we were going to quietly dismantle every single pillar of their escape route. We would freeze the hidden accounts trap, the LLC, and lock them in a legal and financial cage they could never escape. We vowed right there in the darkness of the concrete garage to strip them of absolutely everything they held dear, ensuring that when the dust finally settled, they would be the ones left with nothing. The following Monday, I walked into my corporate office, bypassed my usual risk assessment models, and opened a blank legal template. My career had been built on identifying structural vulnerabilities and mitigating catastrophic loss for multinational conglomerates. Now I was reverse engineering that exact skill set to design a lethal financial trap. I spent 6 hours drafting a masterfully convoluted contract. On the surface, it read like a standard collateralized asset transfer, heavily padded with dense tax code citations, corporate jargon, and phantom clauses designed to induce immediate fatigue in the reader. In reality, it was an irrevocable, ironclad surrender of intellectual property and equity. That evening, I returned to our colonial home to find Derek pacing the living room. He was growing impatient, his carefully constructed mask of a loving, concerned husband beginning to fray at the edges as my corporate stock vesting date approached. I set my briefcase on the kitchen island, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and called him over with a warm, exhausted sigh. I told him I had spent the entire day reviewing my portfolio with my wealth manager. I confessed with a perfectly manufactured tone of humble defeat that he and my parents were right. Cassidy and the baby needed immediate substantial security, and hiding behind my premarital assets was selfish. I announced my intention to fully fund a $200,000 Nephew trust fund. I watched the greed ignite behind his eyes. It was a visceral, hungry flash that he could not entirely suppress. He instantly calculated that this was his getaway money served up on a silver platter entirely separate from the house equity he was already draining. He rushed forward, wrapping his arms around my waist, praising my generosity, and whispering about how proud he was of my personal growth and familial loyalty. I let him hold me for exactly 3 seconds before pulling back with a deeply troubled frown. I told him there was a massive logistical problem. Liquidating that volume of vested stock in a single quarter would trigger a catastrophic capital gains event. I fabricated a terrifying scenario involving heavy IRS tax penalties, explaining that moving raw cash into a trust for a non-immediate dependent would red flag our entire joint financial network for a federal audit. I let the word hang in the air. An audit would freeze all our accounts indefinitely, scrutinizing every single transaction, including the hidden funds he desperately needed right now. Derek panicked. The mere mention of an IRS audit threatened to expose his fraudulent second mortgage and his hidden LLC in Texas long before he was ready to vanish. His breathing quickened, the color draining from his face, as he demanded to know if my wealth manager had found a loophole. I waited a beat, letting his anxiety peak, before slowly sliding the thick stack of legal documents across the marble countertop. I told him there was exactly one viable workaround: to bypass the tax penalties and legitimize the massive cash transfer we needed to execute a zero-sum asset swap. I explained that if he temporarily transferred the entirety of his startup equity and his proprietary software algorithms into my sole name, we could legally categorize the $200,000 as corporate seed funding rather than a taxable family gift. I buried the lie in a labyrinth of authentic-sounding financial terminology. I used phrases like liability, shielding, capital offset protocols, and reciprocal equity balancing. I knew Derek's psychological profile flawlessly. He was a charismatic salesman, a pitchman who dealt in broad concepts and visionary rhetoric. He possessed absolutely zero financial literacy. He hated dense paperwork, despised administrative details, and relied entirely on fast-talking his way out of complexities. I told him the transfer was strictly procedural, a temporary paper shield that we would quietly reverse the moment the fiscal year closed and the trust was fully funded. Derek stared at the contract. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of hesitation crossed his face. This was his startup. The software algorithms he had spent 4 years developing were his only legitimate bargaining chip in the tech world. It was his golden goose. But the intoxicating lure of $200,000 in raw, untraceable cash completely obliterated his common sense. He was so utterly blinded by his own impending victory, so certain that he was about to discard me and flee to Austin with my money, that he could not fathom I was capable of deception. He believed his own illusion of superiority. He believed I was the naive, compliant wife bending over backwards to save her sister. I handed him a high-end fountain pen, casually mentioning that my corporate attorney had to file the exemption paperwork by midnight. If he wanted his own lawyer to review the documents, we would have to delay the trust funding until the next quarter, effectively pausing the payout to Cassidy. It was a calculated gamble, pushing his manufactured urgency against his colossal ego. Derek waved off the suggestion with an arrogant scoff. He claimed he did not need his lawyer poking around our creative tax strategies and potentially flagging the maneuver. He uncapped the pen, leaned heavily over the kitchen island, and rapidly scrawled his signature across all 4 execution lines. He did not read a single paragraph. He did not flip to the addendums. He did not ask to review the fine print outlining the transfer of intellectual property rights. He simply signed away his entire professional livelihood, completely unaware that the document contained absolutely no reversal clause. He handed the pen back to me with a triumphant, dazzling smile, leaning in to kiss my cheek. He thanked me for being the ultimate partner, completely oblivious to the fact that the ink drying on the page had just stripped him of every last asset he possessed. I smiled back carefully, collecting the executed documents and sliding them into my briefcase. The metallic click of the brass locks echoed through the kitchen with absolute devastating finality. While the brass locks of my briefcase secured Derek's financial ruin, Jamal was executing a parallel, equally devastating surgical strike across town. He walked through the sterile, brightly lit administrative corridors of the hospital, deliberately bypassing the chaotic clinical floors where he normally spent his grueling shifts. His destination was the Human Resources Department, a quiet labyrinth of cubicles and filing cabinets tucked away in the subterranean levels of the medical center. Jamal had spent years building a sterling reputation among the hospital staff, known universally as the reliable, endlessly compassionate senior nurse, who never complained about picking up undesirable holiday shifts or covering for sick colleagues. He now weaponized that exact goodwill to secure an immediate unrecorded meeting with the senior benefits director, bypassing the standard bureaucratic delays and electronic queuing systems. He sat across from the director's massive oak desk, his expression pleasant but entirely devoid of its usual warmth, and requested a highly specific preemptive adjustment to his employee benefits package. He initiated the complex multi-tiered paperwork required to sever his spouse from his premium healthcare plan. However, he did not file for an immediate termination, which would have triggered an automatic, legally mandated notification letter to his home address and prematurely alerted Cassidy to the trap. Instead, utilizing his intimate knowledge of the hospital's internal administrative software, Jamal pre-filed the termination documents with a conditional delayed execution order. The paperwork was loaded into the system fully authorized and bearing his verified electronic signature, set to detonate the exact millisecond a formal divorce petition was legally docketed with the county court. In the unforgiving, profit-driven landscape of the American healthcare system, this maneuver was nothing short of a financial death sentence for his wife. Cassidy was currently riding incredibly high on the platinum-tier medical insurance provided by Jamal's union contract. Operating under the arrogant assumption that Jamal would blindly subsidize her recovery, she had unapologetically charged tens of thousands of dollars to her patient account. She had demanded the most exclusive, uninsured private birthing suite available in the luxury maternity wing. She had ordered customized out-of-network postpartum massage therapies, specialized lactation consultants, and premium catered meals that fell entirely outside the scope of standard maternal care. Once Jamal's pre-filed paperwork was triggered by the impending divorce docket, that platinum coverage would instantaneously evaporate. Because the claims for those exorbitant luxury services were still pending in the hospital's notoriously slow billing cycle, the sudden loss of coverage would strip away her protective insurance umbrella before the accounts were settled. The billing department would automatically reject the pending claims and reroute the astronomical, unadjusted invoices directly to Cassidy. She would be instantly crushed under a towering mountain of premium medical debt, legally responsible for every single cent with absolutely no financial safety net to catch her. Leaving the Human Resources office, Jamal pulled his mobile phone from his scrubs and initiated the second phase of his silent war. He logged into the hospital's secure employee payroll portal, navigating to his direct deposit allocations. With a few swift, deliberate keystrokes, he permanently severed the digital link to the joint checking account he shared with Cassidy. He rerouted his entire base salary, all of his accumulated overtime pay, and his upcoming substantial holiday bonus into a brand new solitary account he had quietly opened at a completely different banking institution 3 days prior. He meticulously calculated the exact sum required to keep the lights on and the water running at their cramped apartment, establishing an automated transfer that deposited only the bare minimum needed for basic survival into their old joint account. He left just enough money to maintain the illusion of absolute normalcy. Cassidy was so entirely consumed by her grand fraudulent escape plan and the imaginary windfall she expected to extract from Derek's startup that she would not notice the missing funds until it was entirely too late. The final phase of Jamal's afternoon required a different kind of endurance. He needed undeniable documented proof of her financial infidelity to ensure she was left destitute in the upcoming legal battle. He spent the remainder of his designated lunch break locked inside an empty windowless conference room in the hospital's medical records annex, armed with a thick stack of highlighter pens and his encrypted tablet. He pulled up a year's worth of their shared credit card statements and joint bank ledgers, transforming his heartbreak into a cold forensic audit of his marriage. He methodically cross-referenced every suspicious charge, hunting down the financial discrepancies that he had previously ignored out of blind trust. The evidence of her betrayal was hiding in plain sight, funded entirely by the extra shifts he had worked to support their growing family. He highlighted the luxury boutique hotel bookings billed under the guise of her weekend wellness and yoga retreats, He flagged the exorbitant receipts from high-end downtown steakhouses stamped with dates when she claimed to be visiting her sick aunt in the suburbs. He documented the premium menswear purchases, expensive Italian silk ties, imported cologne, and a vintage leather watch band that certainly never made their way into his own closet. Every single transaction was a glaring neon breadcrumb leading straight to Derek. Cassidy had not just broken her vows, she had committed egregious documented dissipation of marital assets. She had used the money Jamal bled for to finance her illicit romance with another man. He printed every statement, organized the highlighted receipts into a chronological timeline, and compiled a devastating, irrefutable dossier of her financial theft. He placed the heavy stack of evidence into a secure, waterproof binder. He did not let the visceral sting of the betrayal slow his hands. He operated with the detached clinical precision of a surgeon excising a malignant tumor, gathering the exact ammunition required to ensure that when the legal war finally began, Cassidy would be left standing completely unarmed. While Jamal was locking away the damning evidence of his wife's infidelity in a waterproof binder, I was sitting in the immaculate sunlit expanse of my home office, orchestrating the next phase of my own retaliatory strike. My personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass surface of my desk. The caller ID flashed a name that instantly made my blood run cold: Cynthia, Derek's mother. The woman who had spent the last decade treating me less like a daughter-in-law and more like a poorly performing corporate asset she had been forced to acquire. I let the device ring 3 times, composing my features into a mask of serene compliance before answering with a perfectly measured tone of bright enthusiasm. Cynthia did not bother with basic pleasantries. She launched directly into a breathless, self-important monologue about her latest grand social endeavor. The family, she declared, was hosting a lavish sip-and-see baby introduction party at the ultra-exclusive Oakbridge Country Club. She described the event with a sickening level of detail. There would be imported French champagne flowing from crystal towers, a massive ice sculpture of a stork dominating the main ballroom, a live classical string quartet flown in from the city, and a 5-course artisanal catering menu prepared by a local celebrity chef. It was a grotesque theatrical display of wealth designed solely to impress the country club elite and elevate her own social standing under the guise of welcoming the new infant into the world. Then came the inevitable pivot. Cynthia's voice dropped an octave, taking on a sharp, heavily condescending edge. She informed me that my recent behavior had been distinctly disappointing. She cited my supposed selfishness, my unacceptable delays in liquidating my corporate stocks to help Derek, and my general lack of outward enthusiasm for his noble dedication to his brother's growing family. She painted a picture of me as a cold, calculating career woman who was failing her basic familial duties. She told me that I needed to make immediate amends. I needed to prove my loyalty to the family name and demonstrate that I was truly committed to their happiness. Her chosen method for my redemption was a $20,000 catering and venue invoice. She demanded that I pay the entire bill, framing the extortion as a generous, one-time opportunity for me to redeem myself in her eyes and fix my damaged reputation within their social circle. I did not sigh. I did not argue, raise my voice, or attempt to reason with her staggering entitlement. Instead, a slow, predatory smile spread across my face. I stared out the window at my meticulously manicured lawn, my voice dripping with manufactured contrition. I told Cynthia she was absolutely right. I apologized profusely for my recent distraction, blaming the stressful corporate quarter and a heavy workload, and assured her that absolutely nothing would make me happier than funding the extravagant celebration. I laid the subservience on thick, thanking her for giving me the chance to contribute to such a beautiful milestone. I asked her to email the secure payment portal link directly to my personal inbox so I could handle the expense immediately. Cynthia audibly preened, her smug satisfaction radiating through the phone speaker. She praised my sudden return to common sense, reminded me that family always comes first, and abruptly ended the call without another word. The moment the payment link arrived in my inbox, I opened a secure browser window. I had absolutely no intention of draining my own hard-earned liquidity to finance Cynthia's vanity project. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a sleek, heavy credit card. It was a premium high-limit rewards card that I had never applied for. I had discovered its existence weeks ago during my deep dive audit of Derek's hidden digital footprint. He had secretly opened the account entirely in my name, forging my signature and utilizing my stellar credit score to secure a massive line of credit. He had been quietly using it to float his own phantom expenses, operating under the arrogant assumption that I was too busy with my career to ever run a detailed check on my own credit report. I typed the 16-digit account number into the country club's payment portal. I entered the expiration date and the security code with deliberate, unhurried precision. I watched the loading circle spin on the screen, processing the astronomical $20,000 charge for the catering, the opulent venue, the ice sculpture, and the champagne. The confirmation screen flashed a bright, validating green. The payment was approved, successfully shifting the entire financial burden of the lavish party onto the fraudulent account. I printed the receipt and placed it neatly inside a fresh manila folder. I then opened a new tab and navigated directly to the official portal for the federal authorities. I began drafting a comprehensive sworn identity theft report. I attached the digital logs proving Derek had originated the credit application from his personal computer network. I documented his forged digital signatures and highlighted the exact dates the account was opened without my knowledge or consent. By initiating this formal fraud investigation, I was legally severing myself from the debt and pinning the grand larceny directly onto my husband. Derek had opened the card illegally, and because I was reporting the identity theft through official federal channels, he was going to be held solely and criminally liable for the entire $20,000 balance I had just authorized. I clicked submit, sealing the official complaint. Let Cynthia drink her imported champagne and toast to her social supremacy under the glittering chandeliers. The family was about to choke on the bill. The ink on the identity theft claim had barely dried in the digital ether before I shifted my crosshairs to the main target. I closed the credit bureau tab and opened a heavily encrypted folder labeled simply with a federal routing code. Cassidy and Derek's LLC was the beating heart of their escape plan, a fictitious corporate entity designed to launder marital assets and shield them from the impending divorce proceedings. But what they considered a clever domestic shield was in reality a blatant, easily provable case of federal tax evasion. The United States government does not take kindly to citizens creating shell companies to funnel untaxed income, and my corporate background had trained me to spot the exact trigger points that would summon the full, terrifying wrath of the Internal Revenue Service. The Criminal Investigation Division does not waste resources on petty spats, so I had to ensure my submission was a guaranteed prosecution. I spent the next 3 hours compiling an airtight, heavily documented whistleblower submission. I did not just send a vague, emotional tip. I provided the IRS with a fully mapped forensic financial schematic. I uploaded the falsified ledger sheets, highlighting the exact discrepancies where Cassidy had inflated operating costs. I attached the phantom expense reports she had generated to zero out the company's taxable income, essentially robbing the federal government to fund her clandestine new life. I provided the routing numbers for the hidden offshore accounts they were using to stash the funneled cash, tracing the digital money trail with absolute precision. I also attached the Texas residential lease agreements, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that corporate funds were being illegally utilized for personal, undeclared living expenses. It was a perfectly gift-wrapped indictment. I filled out the official Form 211, legally registering my status as a federal whistleblower, and hit submit. The confirmation page flashed on my screen, assigning me a tracking number. It was the silent launch of a bureaucratic missile. The IRS did not act quickly, but when they finally moved, they moved with the unstoppable, crushing force of a glacier. Derek and Cassidy's financial lifeboat was now actively targeted for federal seizure. With the federal trap set, it was time to escalate the local immediate consequences. I powered down my laptop, locked it inside my wall safe, and grabbed the thick manila folders containing the hard copies of my identity theft evidence. I did not submit this next phase from the comfort of my home office. I drove straight to the Central Police Precinct downtown. The air inside the station was stale, smelling of cheap coffee and floor wax, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of my corporate life. I sat at a scratched metal desk, across from a weary financial crimes detective. I did not act like an angry, vengeful wife scorned by infidelity. I played the role of a meticulous, deeply concerned professional who had just discovered a massive, terrifying breach of her personal security. I handed over the perfectly organized stacks of paper. I showed him the forged signatures on the second mortgage application, placing them side by side with my actual legal signature for comparison. I provided the IP address logs, proving the fraudulent credit accounts had been opened directly from Derek's personal devices within our shared network. I gave him the catering receipt from Cynthia's country club party, definitively linking the stolen funds directly to my husband's family and establishing a clear motive for the theft. The detective's initial apathy vanished as he flipped through the undeniable mountain of proof. He recognized immediately that this was not a petty domestic dispute. It was a textbook case of felony fraud. He took my official sworn statement typing steadily as I recounted the exact timeline of unauthorized accounts. When I walked out of the precinct 2 hours later, I held a stamped official police report. Derek was no longer just a cheating husband. He was the primary suspect in an active, escalating criminal investigation. The subsequent fallout was beautifully, brutally automated. Armed with the official police report number, I immediately contacted the 3 major credit bureaus. I initiated hard security freezes on my social security number and formally disputed the second mortgage and every single credit card Derek had tethered to my name. The moment those disputes were registered, accompanied by a verified criminal case number, the financial algorithms took over. The protective firewall I had built around my own assets instantly severed Derek from my pristine credit history. He was suddenly left standing entirely on his own, and his actual financial profile was a catastrophic wasteland. Without the artificial inflation of my credit score masking his toxic debts, Derek's real numbers plummeted with terrifying speed. He went from a prime borrower to a high-risk liability in a matter of hours. The plunge triggered a massive automated domino effect across the banking sector. The credit crash was loud, immediate, and completely inescapable. Automated alerts began firing from every financial institution he had ever interacted with. The secondary, high-interest loans he had taken out to fund his failing startup immediately flagged him as critically delinquent. The algorithm identified his sudden massive drop in creditworthiness and responded by instantly slashing the limits on his few remaining legitimate credit cards to zero. The banks aggressively moved to protect their capital, freezing his access to liquid cash and halting all pending transfers. His auto loan provider generated an automatic warning regarding the sudden breach of his lending terms, flagging his luxury vehicle for potential repossession. The digital walls were closing in on him at the speed of light. Derek was standing in the middle of a collapsing financial building, completely unaware that the foundation had just been vaporized. Every swipe of his card, every attempt to transfer funds, and every desperate move to access his hidden escape money would now be met with a bright red flashing rejection screen. While Derek was undoubtedly staring at his smartphone in a cold sweat, discovering the catastrophic evaporation of his digital escape route, I was forced to play my part in the physical world. Cynthia had commandeered a private VIP suite at a luxury downtown boutique for a mandatory family dress fitting. The Sip and See was only 48 hours away, and her obsession with aesthetic perfection demanded that the women of the family be color-coordinated in pastel shades of nauseatingly innocent blush and cream. I arrived at the boutique exactly on time, stepping onto the plush white carpets and breathing in the scent of expensive silk and chilled champagne. Cynthia was already there, directing a swarm of flustered tailors with the manic energy of a battlefield commander, while Cassidy held court on a velvet chaise lounge. She looked remarkably rested for a new mother, practically glowing with the arrogant certainty of a woman who believed she had just secured a lifetime of stolen luxury. I took a seat, sipping sparkling water and offering polite, vacant nods as Cynthia aggressively critiqued hem lengths and fabric swatches. Then the curtain to the primary dressing room slid back. Cassidy stepped onto the viewing pedestal, posing in front of the trifold mirrors. My breath caught in my throat, though I immediately suppressed the physical reaction. She was not wearing a pastel gown selected by Cynthia. She was wearing a breathtaking emerald green Oscar de la Renta evening gown. It was my gown. I had custom ordered it 3 months prior, keeping it carefully preserved in its garment bag in my cedar closet, specifically intended for my upcoming 10-year wedding anniversary with Derek. She had deliberately bypassed the security system of our home, gone into my personal closet, removed my custom tailoring, and brought it to the boutique to have the seamstresses alter it to fit her postpartum frame. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the theft was staggering. It was a psychological strike designed to assert dominance. Cynthia clapped her hands in delight, completely oblivious to the gown's true ownership, praising how the emerald silk complemented Cassidy's complexion and declaring that she must wear it as the guest of honor. Cassidy caught my eye in the mirror. Her gaze was not apologetic. It was a direct territorial challenge. She stepped down from the pedestal and glided over to where I sat, the heavy silk swishing against the carpet. Under the guise of adjusting a delicate diamond bracelet on her wrist, she leaned in close. Her expensive perfume mixed with the scent of malice as she positioned her mouth inches from my ear. "Do not look so sour, Brianna," she whispered, her voice a razor-thin blade of pure venom. "It fits me so much better anyway. Besides, barren women do not need nice dresses." The cruelty of the remark was designed to break me, to reduce me to tears, or provoke a screaming, hysterical outburst that would brand me as the unstable, jealous sister-in-law Cynthia already believed me to be. Cassidy wanted a public meltdown. She wanted me to shatter. But the insult did not land. It simply bounced off the impenetrable, icy armor I had spent the last several weeks forging. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I simply turned my head, met her smug, expectant gaze, and offered her a serene, radiantly genuine smile. I told her she was absolutely right, that the dress suited her current situation perfectly, and that she should absolutely wear it to the country club. I watched a flicker of unease cross her face, a momentary confusion at my absolute lack of devastation, before she masked it with another arrogant smirk and spun back to the mirrors. I endured the rest of the fitting with the placid grace of a saint, quietly excusing myself the moment my own agonizingly dull cream dress was pinned and packaged. I drove back to my colonial home, the silence in the car a stark contrast to the symphony of vengeance orchestrating in my mind. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight into my home office, locking the heavy mahogany door behind me. The time for gathering ammunition was over. It was time to assemble the weapon. I walked over to the built-in bookshelves and retrieved a sleek, heavy box crafted from midnight blue velvet. It was an antique presentation case, originally designed to hold a breathtaking diamond necklace, but its contents today would be infinitely more valuable. I sat at my desk and unlocked my secure filing cabinet. I moved with deliberate ceremonial precision. First, I took the pristine notarized copy of the DNA test results, the irrefutable, scientific proof that Derek was the biological father of Cassidy's child, and laid it flat against the velvet lining. Next came the densely packed, irrevocably binding divorce petition, fully drafted by my high-powered legal team and ready for immediate filing, outlining the total liquidation of our marriage and my absolute claim to all remaining assets. I smoothed the edges of the divorce papers before retrieving the third document. It was a printed copy of the official confirmation receipt from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, displaying the whistleblower tracking number and the terrifying audit notice that was currently hurtling toward Cassidy's fraudulent limited liability company. I placed it gently on top of the legal filings. Finally, I added the crowning piece of the collection, the stamped, verified police reports detailing the massive identity theft, the forged second mortgage, and the illegally opened credit cards, effectively framing Derek for multiple counts of felony fraud. I stared down into the velvet box. It contained no jewelry, no sentimental keepsakes, and no fond memories. It was a perfectly organized anthology of absolute ruin. It was the complete obliteration of Derek's reputation, Cassidy's financial safety net, and Cynthia's precious social standing, all neatly packaged in high bond paper. I slowly closed the heavy lid, the brass clasp snapping shut with a sharp, satisfying click that echoed through the quiet room. I ran my fingertips over the soft velvet surface, a feeling of profound, icy tranquility washing over me. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the grand stage of the country club was waiting. 48 hours later, the heavy oak doors of the Oakbridge Country Club swung open to reveal the exact breathtaking manifestation of my $20,000 trap. The grand ballroom was a magnificent, grotesque monument to Cynthia's unyielding vanity and Derek's impending criminal liability. The soaring walls were draped in cascading cream silk, and massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a sea of aggressively curated guests. In the exact center of the room, precisely as Cynthia had demanded, stood a towering 6-foot ice sculpture of a stork slowly melting into a silver drip pan, surrounded by imported white orchids. Waitstaff in immaculate white tuxedos circulated through the crowd with military precision, bearing heavy silver trays loaded with beluga caviar blinis and tall crystal flutes of the ultra-premium French champagne I had authorized on Derek's fraudulent credit line. Every opulent detail, every expensive bite of artisanal catering, and every vibrant note played by the live string quartet situated in the corner was a nail in his financial coffin. I stood at the entrance of the ballroom, letting the sheer dizzying scale of the deception wash over me. The room was packed to absolute capacity, vibrating with the suffocating energy of manufactured prestige. Thomas Derek's father held court near the private mahogany bar, completely surrounded by a tight circle of his wealthy golf buddies. They were loud, red-faced men in bespoke tailoring, slapping each other heavily on the back and trading arrogant boasts about their stock portfolios and summer homes. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the son of their proud host was hours away from a devastating federal indictment. Across the polished dance floor, Cynthia fluttered through a flock of her elite socialite friends. They were women wrapped in designer labels and dripping in diamonds, exchanging fake air-kissed pleasantries, while their eyes silently tallied the exorbitant cost of the event. Cynthia was in her absolute element, soaking up their envious compliments and taking full, unapologetic credit for the lavish spread. She radiated the smug satisfaction of a woman who firmly believed she had successfully bullied her daughter-in-law into total financial submission. Near the towering glass windows overlooking the manicured 18-hole golf course stood Derek, completely engulfed by a cluster of sharp-suited men he had proudly introduced to me weeks ago as his core venture capital investors. These were the men he had relentlessly manipulated into believing his software algorithms were the next tech goldmine. The very same men he was planning to abandon the moment he fled to Austin with my cash. He was laughing loudly, projecting the flawless aura of a wildly successful tech entrepreneur, entirely unaware that the proprietary assets he was currently bragging about had been legally transferred to my sole ownership and locked away forever. Beside him stood Cassidy, looking undeniably radiant in my stolen emerald green Oscar de la Renta gown. She was cradling the infant, posing for the professional photographers Cynthia had hired for the occasion, playing the role of the exhausted but triumphant new mother to absolute perfection. Her eyes locked onto mine across the crowded ballroom, and she offered a tiny, victorious smirk, entirely confident that her cruel insult at the dress fitting had successfully shattered my spirit. I broke eye contact and scanned the perimeter of the room until I finally found Jamal. He was standing near a massive cascading floral arrangement near the terrace doors, deliberately isolating himself from the celebratory chaos. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders tense and his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. His eyes were sharp and intensely focused. He was watching Cassidy play the flawless mother in her stolen gown, watching Derek play the devoted family man, and watching Cynthia parade around the room like undisputed royalty. To the rest of the country club guests, Jamal was simply the quiet, overwhelmed husband, taking a brief moment to breathe away from the crowds. But I knew exactly what he was doing. He was waiting. We exchanged a single imperceptible glance across the vast expanse of the ballroom. It was a silent, chilling confirmation between two soldiers who had spent weeks arming a payload and were now standing patiently at ground zero, waiting for the final countdown to begin. The ambient chatter of the ballroom suddenly hushed, as the sharp, repetitive clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute cut through the music. Cynthia had positioned herself at a beautifully decorated podium, set up beside the melting ice sculpture, the microphone humming to life as she tapped it with perfectly manicured fingers. She adjusted her pearls plastered on a dazzling camera-ready smile and began a speech that was a masterclass in passive-aggressive exclusion. She warmly welcomed the country club elite, thanking them profusely for gathering to celebrate the newest, most precious addition to their prestigious family lineage. Her voice took on a sickeningly sweet theatrical tremble as she gestured dramatically toward Cassidy. She praised her daughter-in-law as a flawless, resilient mother, weaving a completely fictional narrative of bravery and maternal sacrifice that made my stomach physically churn. Then, predictably, she pivoted her attention to her son. Cynthia openly wept artificial tears as she lauded Derek for stepping up during a challenging time. She called him the most supportive, amazing, and dedicated uncle any child could ever hope to have, praising his unwavering financial and emotional commitment to his brother's family. It was a staggering, breathtaking display of disrespect. In a speech entirely dedicated to welcoming a new baby, Cynthia purposefully and completely omitted any mention of Jamal, the actual husband and presumed father of the child. He was erased from the narrative, entirely reduced to an invisible ghost in his own life. Similarly, she made absolutely no mention of me, the loyal wife who had supposedly drained her own bank accounts to fund the very champagne Cynthia was currently raising in a toast. We were entirely discarded, cast aside into the shadows so that Derek and Cassidy could shine in the unearned spotlight. The room erupted into polite, synchronized applause as Cynthia concluded her nauseatingly sweet tribute. Cassidy beamed brightly. Derek bowed his head in a display of mock humility, and the string quartet prepared to strike up another vibrant tune. I did not clap. I did not look at Jamal. I did not feel a single trace of anger, humiliation, or sorrow. I felt only cold, absolute clarity. My pulse was steady, my breathing perfectly even. I reached into my designer handbag and let my fingers wrap around the smooth, heavy midnight blue velvet of the antique presentation box. As the applause began to dial down into a polite murmur, I stepped out from the shadows of the perimeter. I kept my head high, my posture immaculate, and my expression entirely serene. Without waiting for an invitation, an introduction, or a break in the music, I began a slow, deliberate, and undeniably calm walk straight through the parting crowd, moving directly toward the center of the ballroom, straight up to the podium, holding the velvet box tightly in my hands. I reached the steps of the dais just as Cynthia prepared to signal the string quartet for another movement. Her perfectly painted lips parted in confusion as I bypassed the floral arrangements and stepped directly onto the raised platform. The musicians, sensing a disruption in the meticulously planned itinerary, trailed off into a discordant scraping halt. I did not ask for permission. I simply reached out and slid the microphone from its silver stand. A brief, sharp whine of feedback pierced the sudden quiet, commanding the absolute attention of every billionaire socialite and corporate shark in the room. I projected my voice, matching the sickly sweet theatrical cadence my mother-in-law had just utilized to perfection. I thanked Cynthia for her beautiful, inspiring words. I stated that as a devoted member of this family, and as someone who had spent the last several weeks reflecting deeply on legacy and truth, I could not let this momentous occasion pass without offering my own highly specific contribution to the child's future. I turned my gaze toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where Derek was standing with his fabricated investors. I smiled warmly and called him to the front. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before his colossal, unearned ego took over. In his mind, this was my public surrender. He assumed I was about to present him with the liquidated stock funds he had been relentlessly demanding, effectively financing his impending escape. He practically strutted across the polished dance floor, adjusting his bespoke suit jacket, flashing that charismatic, entirely hollow salesman smile to his peers. He stepped onto the dais beside me, exuding the smug satisfaction of a victor claiming his prize. I held out the midnight blue velvet box. The brass hinges caught the golden light of the crystal chandeliers, drawing the eyes of every guest in the ballroom. A special gift for the baby's future, I announced, my voice echoing clearly over the state-of-the-art sound system. Derek did not pause. He took the heavy box from my hands, his eyes gleaming with unadulterated greed. He placed it squarely on the white linen of the display table right next to the weeping ice stork and eagerly unfastened the brass latch. He flipped the lid open fully, expecting to find a certified check or the keys to a new luxury asset. Instead, he found a densely packed, unglamorous stack of high-bond paper. Confusion furrowed his brow, momentarily fracturing his practiced smile. He reached in his fingers, catching the edge of the top document in an attempt to pull it free. As he yanked, the entire meticulously organized stack caught on the velvet lining and tumbled forward. Pages spilled like a waterfall across the table, sliding past the imported orchids and brushing against the silver drip pan of the melting sculpture. The glaring red stamps of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division audit notice lay exposed. The stark black and white headers of the felony fraud police reports fanned out across the linen. The impeccably drafted divorce petition demanding total asset liquidation slid toward the edge. And right in the center, landing face up under the harsh light of the chandeliers, were the heavily highlighted medical DNA test results. Derek's face drained of blood, turning a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His eyes darted wildly over the bold, undeniable lettering. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed completely, emitting only a strangled, pathetic gasp. He looked up at me, panic finally shattering his illusion of superiority. I did not lower the microphone. I leaned into it, ensuring my voice resonated with crisp, devastating clarity across the hushed, expectant ballroom. "My gift is giving this child his true last name," I declared, the words slicing through the heavy, perfumed air with lethal precision. I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with the trembling shell of the man I had married. "Congratulations, Derek. You have just been promoted from uncle to father." The silence that followed was absolute, a terrifying vacuum of sound that seemed to stretch for an eternity. It was the collective shock of 200 high society guests, simultaneously processing the nuclear detonation of a prominent family's reputation live on stage. Then the vacuum imploded. Absolute, unmitigated chaos descended upon the Oakbridge Country Club. A woman near the front gasped loudly, dropping her crystal flute. The glass shattered sharply against the hardwood floor, breaking the spell. Cynthia let out a shrill, hysterical shriek, lunging toward the display table in a desperate bid to snatch the papers and hide the evidence, but she was entirely too late. The investors Derek had been courting all evening surged forward, their predatory corporate instincts overriding country club decorum. They scrambled over each other, snatching the spilled pages directly from the tablecloth. One of the venture capitalists grabbed the IRS whistleblower confirmation, his eyes widening as he read the federal tax evasion charges aloud to the men beside him. Another scooped up the DNA results, loudly confirming the 99.9% match to the surrounding crowd. The fake prestige of the evening dissolved instantly into a frenzied, voyeuristic scramble for the truth. The very people Cynthia had invited to witness her social triumph were now aggressively consuming her family's complete destruction. I looked across the ballroom through the shifting, panicked sea of guests. Cassidy was frozen near the terrace doors in her stolen emerald gown. The arrogant smirk she had worn all evening was gone, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. She clutched the infant tightly against her chest as the socialites she had so desperately tried to impress began pointing, whispering, and stepping away from her as if she were carrying a contagious disease. Her opulent, stolen life was burning to ash around her. And standing just a few feet away, perfectly still amidst the swirling pandemonium, was Jamal. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had just watched the heavy steel door of a prison swing open, completely vindicated and entirely free. Jamal stepped out of the shadows, moving with a terrifying, deliberate grace through the shrieking, frantic crowd. The panicked socialites instinctively parted for him, pulling their silk gowns aside and sensing the raw, contained power radiating from his every step. He did not rush or raise his hands. He walked a perfectly straight, unyielding line toward Cassidy. She was now backed up against the heavy glass of the terrace doors, trembling so violently that the vintage champagne in her crystal flute threatened to spill over the delicate rim. The smug, entitled woman who had boldly stolen my custom gown and paraded my husband's biological child as her own was entirely gone. In her place stood a cornered, hyperventilating fraud. She opened her mouth, desperately searching for a lie, an excuse or a manipulative tear to spin the irrefutable DNA evidence currently circulating through the ballroom, but her throat clamped shut. No words came. Jamal stopped mere inches from her, his expression an impenetrable fortress of calm resolve. He did not yell or create a theatrical spectacle. With absolute chilling dignity, Jamal reached over with his right hand and smoothly slid the heavy gold wedding band off his left ring finger. He held it suspended directly over Cassidy's trembling crystal flute for a fraction of a second, forcing her to watch before letting it fall. The heavy gold band hit the expensive champagne with a sharp splash, sinking instantly to the bottom of the glass, where it rested among the rising bubbles. The visual was poetic, final, and absolute. Jamal then leaned in his deep voice, carrying just enough volume to ensure that the breathless, eavesdropping bystanders, hanging on their every interaction, heard him perfectly. He informed her that he had spent his entire morning coordinating with his corporate human resources department. As of the stroke of midnight tonight, her premium top-tier spousal health insurance policy was permanently and irrevocably terminated. He clarified with brutal surgical articulation that this retroactive cancellation left her personally responsible for the entirety of the $45,000 VIP maternity hospital bill. The lavish recovery suite, the private gourmet meals, and the specialized postpartum care she had arrogantly insisted upon booking, assuming he would silently finance her luxurious recovery, was now entirely her legal burden. With her fraudulent LLC under active federal investigation, her secret bank accounts frozen, and Derek's credit score pulverized into dust, she was utterly, inescapably bankrupt. Jamal stepped back, adjusting his cuffs, and turned away from her as if she were completely invisible. The sound of Jamal's quiet, devastating dismissal snapped Derek out of his catatonic, horrified shock. He was standing near the podium, surrounded by the scattered, damning remnants of his destroyed life. His venture capital investors were literally walking out the heavy oak doors in disgust, aggressively dialing their legal teams to immediately sever all financial ties. Derek's meticulously crafted illusion of the brilliant, untouchable tech entrepreneur had been vaporized in less than 5 minutes. Stripped of his stolen money, his pristine reputation, and his false pride, all that remained in him was raw, venomous, unadulterated rage. His handsome face flushed a dangerous mottled crimson, the veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his tailored collar. He locked his crazed, bloodshot eyes directly on me. I was the architect of his ruin, the woman who had stubbornly refused to play the role of the quiet, discarded victim. With a guttural, feral roar that tore through the ambient noise of the ballroom, Derek lunged violently across the platform, launching himself directly at me with his hands outstretched like claws. I did not take a single step backward. I did not even blink. Before Derek could cross the short distance between us, Jamal intercepted him with the speed and precision of a guided missile. Moving with flawless protective instinct, Jamal stepped smoothly into Derek's chaotic path, grabbing him fiercely by the lapels of his expensive bespoke suit and utilizing Derek's own furious momentum against him. In one swift, incredibly fluid motion, Jamal twisted his torso, sweeping Derek's legs completely out from under him and driving him forcefully into the polished hardwood floor. The heavy impact echoed sharply over the fading whispers of the crowd. Jamal dropped his knee squarely onto Derek's chest, pinning him to the ground with inescapable crushing force. Derek thrashed wildly, gasping for air, as his face was pressed mercilessly against the floorboards. Utterly humiliated and completely neutralized in front of the very elite society he had spent years trying to impress. Jamal glared down at him, his voice a low, dangerous warning, ordering him to stay exactly where he was. While Derek lay pinned and panting on the floor like a subdued animal, a second equally devastating realization was taking root near the desecrated display table. Thomas and Cynthia had dropped to their knees, their designer clothes gathering dust as they desperately gathered the spilled documents in a frantic, futile effort to hide the truth from their peers. Cynthia snatched the Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation audit notice, her eyes scanning the bold black text, detailing the massive tax evasion scheme tied directly to Cassidy's fictitious corporate entity. Her heavily powdered face abruptly drained of all color, transforming into a stark mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She shoved the crinkled paper into Thomas's trembling hands. He read the federal indictment details, and I watched the exact pathetic moment his arrogant country club bravado shattered into a million irreparable pieces. In their blind eagerness to support Cassidy and Derek's secret escape fund, Thomas and Cynthia had eagerly provided their signatures, proudly co-signing the business loans and official registration documents for the fraudulent shell company. They had smugly intended to help their precious nephew build his fictitious empire. Instead, they had legally and permanently bound themselves to a massive federal tax fraud conspiracy. The United States government was not just coming to seize Derek's hidden assets, The unstoppable force of the IRS was now actively targeting Thomas's lucrative investment portfolios, his offshore accounts, and Cynthia's beloved suburban estate. The pristine, untouchable reputation they valued above oxygen was officially dead, replaced by the terrifying, inescapable certainty of impending federal prosecution. The morning sun rose over the city, casting a brilliant, mocking glow over the absolute wreckage of the previous night. While Cynthia and Thomas spent the early dawn hours in a state of hyperventilating panic, frantically dialing a rotation of high-priced, white-collar defense attorneys to shield them from federal tax prosecution, and Cassidy sat sobbing in a dark, unfurnished apartment with a canceled premium insurance policy. Derek made a frantic, desperate dash for his very last remaining lifeline. I knew exactly where he would go because I had mapped his psychological descent and anticipated his every move weeks in advance. Driven by blind panic, severe physical bruising from Jamal's unforgiving takedown, and the terrifying reality of his impending financial annihilation, Derek drove straight to the downtown high-rise offices of his corporate legal team. He practically sprinted through the revolving glass doors of the towering glass and steel lobby, his usually immaculate, calculated appearance replaced by the haggard, sweating desperation of a hunted man. He aggressively bypassed the startled receptionist, ignoring her protests, and burst uninvited into the corner office of his lead corporate counsel, a seasoned attorney named Marcus. Derek did not sit down. He did not ask for strategic advice. He immediately began issuing frantic, breathless demands. He ordered Marcus to freeze all regular operations and initiate a catastrophic immediate fire sale of his entire tech startup. He demanded that the proprietary algorithms, the encrypted server, erase the commercial patents, and every shred of digital infrastructure be liquidated to the highest possible bidder within 48 hours. He no longer cared about his inflated venture capital valuations, his board seats, or his dreams of long-term market dominance. He simply needed a massive, immediate infusion of untraceable liquid cash to fund his criminal defense and flee the sinking ship he had so arrogantly built. Marcus did not flinch. He did not reach for his polished silver telephone to begin calling tech brokers or venture capitalists. Instead, the seasoned lawyer folded his hands calmly on the surface of his pristine oak desk and looked up at Derek with a chilling mixture of professional pity and profound disdain. Marcus slowly opened a thick leather-bound portfolio and extracted a single heavily notarized contract. He slid it across the smooth expanse of the desk until it rested directly under Derek's trembling hands. Derek stared down at the paperwork, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically across the dense legal jargon, his exhausted brain struggling to comprehend the absolute finality of the clauses. Marcus, maintaining a tone of icy, unwavering professionalism, informed his client that a liquidation protocol was entirely impossible. He explained that 3 months prior, during a routine sweep of quarter-end corporate restructuring, documents Derek had hastily and carelessly signed without reading a single page because he was entirely too preoccupied with funneling embezzled cash into Cassidy's fictitious LLC, a massive transfer of ownership had occurred. I had not just insulated my own personal assets, I had aggressively and legally annexed his. Through a perfectly executed, completely binding series of holding company transfers, buried deep within the compliance paperwork Derek had blindly authorized, I had secured 100% legal ownership of his startup's intellectual property. Every single line of proprietary code, every registered patent, every physical server rack, and every digital asset was now exclusively registered to a blind trust completely controlled by me. Derek was no longer a visionary tech founder. He was merely a redundant employee of an empty corporate shell, and his services were effectively immediately terminated. Marcus brutally clarified the new reality of the situation. Derek possessed zero equity to sell. He held no voting rights to leverage. He had absolutely no authority to liquidate a single paperclip belonging to the company. I had permanently locked him out of the very empire he had planned to use as his golden parachute. His biometric access badges had been remotely deactivated. At the stroke of midnight, his corporate email was permanently disabled, and my newly appointed private security team was currently guarding the server rooms with strict orders to deny him entry. Derek was left staring at his own sprawling signature on the contract, the horrific realization washing over him that his monumental hubris had blinded him to the fact that I had legally cannibalized his entire professional existence. The last remaining oxygen seemed to vanish from the corner office. Derek collapsed heavily into a leather guest chair, burying his face in his trembling hands as the full, inescapable weight of his total ruin crushed the breath from his lungs. He was entirely broke, his reputation was thoroughly vaporized, and he was completely cornered. But the automated, relentless sequence of my vengeance had not yet finished executing its final command. Before Derek could even attempt to beg Marcus for a personal off-the-books loan or formulate another pathetic, desperate escape strategy, the heavy glass doors of the corner office swung open. The receptionist stood trembling in the threshold, stepping aside nervously to reveal two tall, unsmiling men dressed in sharply tailored, inconspicuous gray suits. They did not look like corporate investors, rival tech developers, or sympathetic allies. The heavy, polished gold badges clipped securely to their leather belts identified them immediately. They were financial crimes detectives from the Central Police Precinct. They stepped into the opulent room, their expressions carved from absolute stone, radiating the terrifying, unstoppable authority of the law. The lead detective locked eyes with Derek, who was still helplessly clutching the useless corporate transfer documents in his shaking hands. The detective addressed my husband by his full legal name, his voice a low, booming baritone that left absolutely no room for negotiation, manipulation, or escape. He announced that they were there to formally question him regarding an active, rapidly escalating felony investigation. He cited the exact tracking numbers corresponding to the perfectly organized evidence I had personally delivered to the precinct. The detective clearly and methodically listed the charges: multiple counts of aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and the felonious forging of signatures on a secondary residential mortgage application. He explicitly mentioned the unauthorized, high-limit credit accounts that had been systematically drained to fund an illicit lifestyle, confirming that the Internet Protocol addresses and digital footprints linked every single fraudulent transaction directly back to Derek's personal devices. Derek sat utterly paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating terror. The sleek, arrogant manipulator who had spent months stealing my identity, lying to my face, and plotting to leave me destitute, was now physically trapped in a sterile corporate office, facing the devastating concrete reality of decades in federal prison. The detectives stepped forward in unison, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts, completely unmoved by his visible hyperventilating panic. The digital walls I had meticulously built around him had officially materialized into physical iron bars, and the trap had definitively permanently snapped shut. While Derek was experiencing the crushing reality of the criminal justice system, Cassidy was discovering that the consequences of her deceit possessed an equally terrifying price tag. The automatic glass doors of Boston General Hospital parted with a mechanical hiss, allowing a frantic, disheveled Cassidy to stumble into the brightly lit, sterile main lobby. The woman who had spent years carefully cultivating an image of effortless country club perfection was entirely gone. Her hair was pulled into a messy, uneven knot. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled, and her eyes were swollen and rimmed with smeared makeup. In her trembling hand, she clutched a thick, stapled envelope from the hospital's billing department. It contained the itemized, staggering invoice for her VIP maternity stay. A multi-page documentation of every luxurious amenity, private catering request, and specialized postpartum care service she had arrogantly ordered under the assumption that her husband's premium medical insurance would silently foot the bill for her affair. She frantically scanned the bustling lobby, ignoring the curious glances of patients and visitors, until she spotted Jamal. He was standing near the secure entrance to the pediatric wing, dressed in pristine scrubs and his white physician's coat, calmly reviewing a medical chart with a senior nurse. He looked entirely in his element, a respected, brilliant doctor in a sanctuary of healing. Cassidy did not care about professional decorum. She rushed across the polished linoleum, her heels clicking erratically, and lunged toward him. She grabbed his forearm, her fingers digging desperately into the crisp white fabric of his coat. Jamal flinched instantly, stepping backward and smoothly prying her hands off him with a look of absolute clinical detachment. He did not raise his voice, nor did he display a single ounce of the rage she likely expected. He simply looked at her as if she were a complete stranger who had wandered into his ward by mistake. Cassidy shattered, completely sobbing hysterically in the middle of the crowded lobby. She begged him to stop the divorce proceedings, her voice rising to a shrill, panicked pitch. She pleaded with him to contact Human Resources to reinstate the spousal health insurance just long enough to cover the massive, crippling medical debt threatening to drag her into immediate bankruptcy. She promised she would leave quietly, promised she would never bother him again, if only he would save her from the financial ruin crashing down upon her head. She attempted to leverage her tears, utilizing the exact same manipulative tactics that had worked on the men in her family for decades. Jamal's expression remained an impenetrable fortress of calm resolve. He looked down at the weeping, pathetic shell of the woman he had once loved and offered no salvation. He informed her, his voice a low, steady hum that carried perfectly over her sobs, that their legal ties were permanently severed. Her access to his accounts was revoked, and her personal belongings were currently sitting in cardboard boxes in a self-storage unit across town. He stated that he had absolutely zero financial, legal, or moral obligation to subsidize the birth of Derek's child. Without waiting for a response, Jamal turned his back on her. He reached up, tapped his proximity badge against the electronic scanner on the wall, and pushed through the heavy double doors of the secure ward. The heavy steel doors clicked firmly shut behind him, locking automatically. Cassidy was left standing entirely alone in the harsh fluorescent light of the lobby, clutching her insurmountable medical debt to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as hospital security guards began to slowly approach her. Across the city, I was settling into a very different kind of reality. The sleek, ergonomic leather chair behind the sprawling oak desk in the executive suite of my newly acquired tech firm was surprisingly comfortable. I was sitting exactly where Derek had intended to rule his fictitious empire, calmly reviewing the asset reallocation files that officially transferred his entire life's work into my private holding trust. The silence of the corner office was absolute, a perfect reflection of my complete control over the situation. That silence was violently shattered when the heavy glass doors to the outer reception area burst open. Shouting echoed down the corridor, followed by the frantic protests of my newly hired private security detail. A moment later, Cynthia and Thomas forcefully shoved their way into my office, looking like survivors of a shipwreck. The polished, arrogant facade they had worn like armor at the country club was completely eradicated. Thomas was sweating profusely, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened, and his face a sickly, pallid gray. Cynthia looked utterly deranged. Her famous pearl necklace tangled her immaculate hair, frayed and wild, and her eyes wide with a manic, consuming terror. They rushed toward my desk, bypassing the security guards who were seconds away from physically restraining them. I raised a single hand, signaling the guards to stand down for a moment. I wanted to hear exactly what they had to say. Thomas slammed his hands onto the edge of my desk, his entire body trembling violently. He begged me to contact the federal authorities, pleading with me to formally withdraw the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower complaints and retract the evidence of the corporate shell company fraud. He breathlessly explained that federal agents had arrived at their estate at dawn, armed with extensive warrants. Their joint bank accounts were completely frozen, their retirement funds were locked, and the government was actively initiating procedures to seize their massive suburban estate, to cover the staggering tax penalties and fines associated with Cassidy's fraudulent business loans. Cynthia fell to her knees, openly weeping, her manicured hands gripping the edge of my desk. She begged for mercy, citing family loyalty, crying that they had only signed the corporate documents to help their nephew, completely ignorant of the fact that they were legally binding themselves to a massive federal tax evasion conspiracy. She pleaded with me to save them from total financial ruin, promising they would do anything, pay any price, if I would simply make the federal indictments disappear. I looked down at the two people who had spent my entire marriage treating me like an inferior, disposable asset. I watched them beg, their pride pulverized into dust by the very system they thought they could manipulate. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single word of comfort. I calmly picked up the sleek office phone and pressed the speed dial button for building security, instructing them to immediately remove the trespassers from the premises. I placed the receiver back onto the cradle and stared at Cynthia and Thomas with eyes as cold and unforgiving as winter ice. "The golden child is going to need a place to stay. You better start packing up your house." The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Cynthia and Thomas, sealing them out of my office and officially closing the chapter on my previous life. The security guards escorted the sobbing, ruined couple through the busy corporate lobby, parading their absolute destruction in front of the very people they had once sought to impress. The dust settled over the battlefield of my marriage, the legal and criminal proceedings executed with the ruthless automated efficiency I had designed. 6 months passed, sweeping away the wreckage they had caused and leaving behind only the stark, unalterable consequences of their blinding greed. The crisp autumn chill eventually gave way to a bright, unforgiving spring, illuminating the vastly different paths we now walked. Derek's grand ambitions of Silicon Valley dominance had been violently downgraded to the harsh, humiliating reality of manual labor. Stripped of his tailored, bespoke suits, his imported watches, and his massive corporate ego, he now wore a fluorescent orange reflective vest over a stained, ill-fitting gray uniform. The judicial system had shown zero leniency toward his extensive documented list of felonies. In lieu of serving maximum federal prison time, his overworked public defender had negotiated a desperate plea deal that required him to pay back hundreds of thousands of dollars in victim restitution and court fines. To meet the aggressive, unyielding garnishment schedules, he was forced to take a grueling minimum-wage sanitation route for the city. His days consisted of hauling heavy, leaking trash receptacles through the very downtown financial districts where he once strutted as a self-proclaimed tech visionary. He emptied the dumpsters of high-rise buildings similar to the one he had tried to steal from me. The physical toll was brutal on his soft, manicured hands, but the psychological destruction was absolute. He could not even secure a basic, rundown studio apartment. His credit score had been utterly obliterated by the mountain of fraud, the IRS liens, and the unpaid debts. Every standard background check flagged him immediately as a high-risk, convicted felon. He spent his exhausting nights sleeping on a thin, lumpy mattress in a crowded, noisy halfway house on the bleak outskirts of the industrial district. He was a complete ghost of the man who thought he could effortlessly outsmart his own wife. His accomplices fared no better in the wake of the implosion. The unstoppable, merciless machine of the Internal Revenue Service had efficiently devoured Cynthia and Thomas's pristine suburban reality. Faced with staggering federal tax penalties, astronomical legal fees, and the very real threat of federal asset seizure, they were forced to hastily liquidate their beloved sprawling estate at a massive, embarrassing loss. The designer furniture, the imported luxury cars, the sparkling jewelry, and the exclusive country club memberships were instantly auctioned off to satisfy their massive government debts. Their new reality was a stark, humiliating contrast to their previous opulence. They were now renting a cramped, deteriorating single-story house in a noisy neighborhood complete with a leaky, unfinished basement. That damp subterranean space was now the permanent home of Cassidy and the infant. The arrogant golden child, completely stripped of her stolen premium health insurance, her stolen venture capital funds, and her stolen social prestige, spent her days trapped underground. She was drowning in staggering, inescapable medical debt from her luxurious hospital stay, constantly opening aggressive collection notices in the dim light of the basement. She spent her waking hours listening to the bitter, relentless screaming arguments of her ruined aunt and uncle upstairs, who now blamed her entirely for their spectacular downfall. The toxic, enabling family dynamic they had so proudly cultivated had finally collapsed inward, trapping them all in a miserable, suffocating prison of their own making. Jamal, conversely, had excised the poison from his life with brilliant surgical precision. Unburdened by Cassidy's manipulative chaos and legally separated from her financial ruin, he had accepted a prestigious, highly coveted placement at a world-renowned upscale research hospital halfway across the country. He sent me a brief, polite email a few weeks prior to finalize some lingering administrative paperwork regarding the canceled insurance policies. He mentioned his new role heading the pediatric cardiology wing in a sunny, vibrant city. He was thriving, surrounded by intellectual peers who respected his brilliant mind and steady character. He was completely at peace, entirely free from the toxic drama that had temporarily infected his world and focused solely on saving lives. We did not keep in touch beyond that single professional exchange. We were two independent survivors who had successfully neutralized a mutual threat, and that shared quiet victory was all the closure either of us required. As for me, the corporate board of directors had taken intense notice of my meticulous, ruthless efficiency in dismantling Derek's fraudulent enterprise and protecting the firm's broader financial assets. They recognized a predator who knew exactly how to protect the pack. I was unanimously promoted to Vice President of Risk Management, a title that came with a sprawling corner office, a massive executive compensation package, and the absolute unquestioned authority I had always deserved. I adjusted the collar of my silk blouse and settled deeply into the plush leather confines of my first-class seat on a transatlantic flight bound directly for Paris. This was a lavish month-long solo vacation paid for with the pristine, untouched funds of my own hard work, massive promotion, and strategic brilliance. The immaculate flight attendant approached with a warm smile and handed me a crystal flute of vintage champagne. The tiny, perfect bubbles rose crisp and clear in the golden liquid catching the ambient cabin light. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the exquisite dry taste wash over me as the massive jet engines roared to life with a powerful, vibrating hum. The plane accelerated rapidly down the runway, the force pushing me comfortably back into my seat before lifting smoothly and effortlessly into the brilliant, cloudless afternoon sky. I looked out the oval window at the shrinking city below, leaving the ground the wreckage and the ghosts of my past far behind me. A genuine, unburdened smile curved my lips. They had all thought I was nothing more than a quiet, predictable, manageable stepping stone. They learned the ultimate devastating lesson the hard way: you never ever bet against a financial risk analyst. The most profound lesson from this saga is the irreplaceable value of strategic independence. When faced with ultimate betrayal, reacting with explosive emotion only arms your adversaries. Instead, true power lies in silent observation, meticulous planning, and leveraging your unique skills to reclaim your life. The protagonist did not just survive her family's deceit, she orchestrated her own absolute justice by remaining clinically detached and financially autonomous. This proves that self-reliance is the ultimate safety net against those who seek to exploit you. What is the most important boundary you have established to protect your own independence? Share your thoughts and comment below.